Welcome to the channel, honoured guests. Before we continue, I'd like to give you the opportunity to like the video, subscribe to the channel and share this content with your favourite and not so favourite nighttime dwellers. With that out of the way, let's begin. Around 2009 or 10, I was going through a period of deep stress and slight insomnia. I have a few stories about that time, but this is the one that fits the topic. I've gone to my grandma's every weekend since my parents' divorce, since that was my dad's custody time, and he usually just pawned me off on his mum. After I turned 18, it just turned into a tradition to, if not spending the night, at least to see her every weekend. Her front door was on the side of the house, with a walkway that wrapped around from the driveway in the front. A giant tree sits right on the inside corner of this walkway, leaving only maybe 3 feet between the thick trunk and the house's corner. One day when we were going to run an errand, I got in the car ready to leave. I waited for a while before eventually getting bored and going to see what was taking her so long. When we were initially leaving the house, she seemed right behind me. So when I reached the car first, I figured she just stayed behind to grab her phone or maybe use the restroom. While walking up to the front door, before reaching the corner, I saw her coming up on the perpendicular walkway towards the same corner. There's less than a second that I see her pass between the tree gap and the house. Long enough to know without a doubt I saw her, but not enough to distinguish anything out of the ordinary, if there was anything. The distance we were from each other meant we would reach the corner at about the same time, but when she didn't emerge from the other side of the tree, or to the corner, I was very confused. I just stood there for a moment, staring down the empty last leg of the walkway towards the front door, not understanding what just happened. That's when my grandma opened the front door and finally left the house. There's absolutely no way any human, let alone this old lady, could have run back into the house in the 0.3 seconds it took me to turn that corner. I still don't understand what happened that day. It may not seem like much of an experience, but it was so inexplicable and unexpected, and it will stick with me forever. My dad woke me up once, shaking me awake and telling me to get up in a very urgent tone he rarely used. I didn't turn around to face him or anything, just fell back asleep after hearing heavy footsteps walk off. Later I woke up in a panic, thinking I had missed an appointment or something. He said he hadn't even left his room. The second time this happened, I woke up and felt like I was being watched. This time I opened my eyes and glanced over to the bathroom door, and my sibling was staring at me. I had fallen asleep in the living room, and my brother slept upstairs, where there was a bathroom much closer to his room. He slowly moved over to the edge of the couch, like weirdly slow. I sat up and told him to go back to bed. That house was so creepy, and I know he wouldn't head downstairs in the middle of the night no matter what. I offered to bring him back up, but he didn't seem to register anything I was saying. So he sat down, and it was pretty much a wordless staring contest. Eventually he left in that same saunter, and I wearily fell back asleep and asked about it in the morning. Yup, never left his room upstairs. I barely slept while I lived in that house. It was always loud, and every night brought something different. Any time I would sleep, I would be startled awake by something. The last one I can remember was my sister coming home, the front door opening and slamming with her yelling up at us, saying she was home before hearing her jog downstairs. She was supposed to be at work, so my mum and I exchanged glances. I went to greet her. I looked everywhere. All the rooms were empty, and the house was quiet. The door never opened again, and everyone in the house at the time was upstairs. We messaged both her and my older sister, both of which were not home and never came home. I kinda wish I got to see what opened the door. Everyone in the house heard it, so that one I can confirm wasn't brought on by sleep-deprived hallucinations, or even a possibility of random sleepwalking. Weird stuff, really. The first two happened at my grandma's old house, where one person passed away, and the last was in our old home. Losing my husband was one of the most devastating experiences of my life. It felt like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving me feeling lost and alone. Just a few months after his passing, my first mother-in-law also passed away. It was a difficult time, and I was struggling to come to terms with the loss of both of these important people in my life. Then, something strange started happening. Every morning at 4 a.m, I would hear 3 knocks on my bedroom French doors, leading onto a screened-in back porch. It happened every single morning, without fail. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or perhaps the wind knocking against the doors. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, I knew that it couldn't be a coincidence. No one was ever there when I opened the doors to investigate, and I knew that no one could have been knocking. Sometimes I wasn't fully asleep when the knocks came, but more often than not, they woke me up. I can't remember if my dog ever reacted to the knocking, but I do remember feeling a strange sense of calm whenever it happened. I was never afraid, even though I couldn't explain what was happening. Some people suggested that the knocks were a sign of something demonic, but I strongly disagreed. To me, it felt like a message from my loved ones who had passed away. Around that time, I started noticing signs and receiving messages from both my late husband and mother-in-law. It felt like they were trying to communicate with me, to let me know that they were still with me in some way. Despite the strange occurrence of the knocks, I was always surrounded by positive energy, love, and light. It was as if my loved ones were trying to reassure me that everything was going to be okay. Even when I heard the knocks in another home, I never felt afraid. I knew that I was protected and that my loved ones were watching over me. Looking back on that time, I still can't explain the meaning behind the knocks. But I know in my heart that they were not a sign of anything negative or demonic. Instead, they were a sign of love and connection, a reminder that my loved ones were always with me, even if they weren't physically present. I was driving home from a party on a dark, deserted road. The radio was playing static, and I couldn't get a signal on my phone. Suddenly, my car started to shake, and the engine sputtered to a stop. I tried to start it again, but it wouldn't budge. I stepped out of the car to see if I could find a signal on my phone, but the darkness was overwhelming. The only light came from the moon, and it cast eerie shadows across the road. I heard a rustling in the bushes, and I spun around to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. My heart pounding, I ran back to the car and locked the doors. But the eyes followed me, and I could hear something scratching at the windows. I started to scream, but the sound was drowned out by the howling wind. Suddenly a figure appeared in the headlights, shrouded in a white sheet. It was floating above the ground, and it beckoned me to follow it. Terrified, I tried to start the car again, and this time it roared to life. I hit the gas and sped away, leaving the ghostly figure behind. I don't know what that thing was or why it was following me, but I never want to go back to that road again. Back in my teens, a young boy, who was around 9 or 10 years old, came up to me and insisted I was his sister. He had been told by his parents to grab his sister for dinner, and he originally thought that I was just trying to get out of coming back home, which is wild because I lived in a small town and was one of the very few goth kids running around. He finally realized I wasn't his sister, and explained how I looked just like his sister, who was the same age as me, and that he had just seen her come into the park that I was walking around in. Me and his sister apparently were also wearing the same exact clothes, not just the style, but even the graphic on my shirt. So that was the day I googled and discovered what doppelgangers are. This started happening last summer and only lasted a few months, and happened 3 or 4 times. First time it happened, I was washing dishes and thought I had seen my husband walk out of our bedroom and to the bathroom. My back would have been to him, so I see this out of the corners of my eyes. The bathroom light didn't turn on though, so I looked and no one was in the bathroom. I checked the room and he was asleep. I could have sworn he went to the bathroom though. A few days later I was sitting outside with my dogs in the middle of the day. It was around the time my husband came home from work. I was laying in my hammock reading a book, and in my peripheral vision saw my husband walk towards our shop. I said, "Hi sweetie, how was work?" while putting down my book and didn't get a response. I got up and realized the shop was closed. Looked out front and his car wasn't there. My dogs had even reacted when I saw it, so I know they saw it too. The last time I didn't see anything, but I heard his voice. Again, right around the time he gets home. I was in our bedroom folding laundry and thought I had heard the door open. I then heard, "No, get down," which he usually would say to our puppy because she would jump on him. I walked out to greet him and no one was there. Looked for his car and it wasn't there. When he got home, I told him about what I had been experiencing. It hasn't happened again since that, but I continue to see shadow figures, which has been happening for years. So, I'm a carefree dude in my 20s at the time of this event. I had just got real baked at my friend's apartment, and I decided to head home afterwards. I'm headed down the sidewalk in broad daylight. Ahead of me I see two young girls, instantly recognizable as Mormon missionaries. They get maybe 50 feet away from me, and one of them waves and calls me by name. We meet, and one of the girls gives a friendly hello, acts like she knows me. Bear in mind I'm pretty stoned, so I'm trying to figure out if I know her from somewhere, but she catches on that I don't recognize her, and acts kind of offended. So she reminds me that we had some big long conversation on her friend's porch, on such and such street just a few days prior. Now at this point in my life I smoked a lot of weed, but I never drank or did anything else, and going to random parties and charming pretty young blondes was completely off the menu. I was already half in love from the moment she smiled at me. I don't think I would have forgotten this long, engrossing conversation we apparently had days ago, high or not. As I stumbled through this conversation, her expressions shifted with concern. At first she thought I was joking, then she thought I was being mean, and then she kind of looked just as confused as I was. So I suggest, "Maybe it was my brother you met." She looks at me skeptically. "Not unless he's your identical twin." Me and my brother look like brothers, but you'd never confuse one for the other. So we awkwardly, confusedly parted ways. I don't remember the other girl ever saying anything, but she looked really concerned and uncomfortable. Then it dawns on my dumb, stoned brain. She knew my name. I turn around. They're a few 100 feet away. I yell, "Wait! How did you know my name?" But they didn't hear me, and I foolishly couldn't muster the courage to run to catch up with them. That incident bugged me for weeks. I wanted to know what we had talked about. Most likely it was about Jesus, but who knows? A part of me wondered if the other me had at least walked away from the conversation with her phone number. Five or 6 years ago, I went to a random IHOP in the middle of nowhere, in Virginia. I drove my then boyfriend there for a work thing, and it was about 2 hours west from where we lived. When the waitress brought our food, she was like, "I made sure everything was done right this time." Like she had definitely seen us before and messed up the order. We had 100% never been there. I'd never even been in the town. So we just thanked her, and then laughed it off because our food looked terrible. Now I wonder, well, I just finished typing that, and my 10-year-old son just randomly asked my dog, "Is your name Brandon?" I asked him why he said that, and he said he didn't know. I am so creeped out right now, because Brandon is the name of my ex-boyfriend from this time that I am writing about, and he has never heard me talk about him by name. Okay, this is too much. I'm going to end this post here. Thanks for reading. I have a few experiences at my old house with these weird encounters. I had experienced strange crap at the house, but my husband at the time hadn't. One morning I'm in the bathroom wearing my blue robe, getting ready for work, and my husband walks in and looks surprised, saying, "You're not wearing black." I looked at him with a confused expression. Apparently, he had just watched me walk into our son's room, wearing a black dress, and had asked me if I was going to wake him up. At the time, our son had been having nightmares at night, and would be even more freaked out if I came in to reassure him. Another time, my kids were sitting in the car in the garage. We're getting ready to leave, and they get all excited, asking when Grandpa got to the house. I'm telling them it's a school day and he's not here. "But we just saw him walk past the garage window," they say. That house had so many crazy things happen when I lived there. Husband got the house post-divorce and he hasn't experienced anything. I was doing a favour months later and hung out with the kids for an hour on his night because he was running late after work. I was sitting on the couch watching the kids play video games, and as it's getting darker, I remember thinking, man, I should have turned on a light before I sat down. A couple minutes later, the kitchen light came on. When he got home, I commented that his new timer on the lights was fancy. Dude got freaked out and said he didn't have one, and that he hasn't had weird stuff happen since I moved out. Perhaps the strange occurrences were all linked to me personally. I have no idea. I was excited to move into my new home, an old house with a rich history, or so the realtor told me. But as soon as my family and I moved in, strange things began to happen. Like at first it was just like little things, like little sounds when there was supposed to be none, or things you thought you saw out of the corner of your eye, but weren't really there when you took a proper look. Doors slowly opening or closing on their own, but slowly it escalated to the point where we could hear footsteps and voices in the middle of the night. Or at least I thought I heard what I thought I heard. The thing is, I don't believe in the paranormal because, not to sound racist or anything, but I'm from East New York, and there are worse things than ghouls in my neighborhood. Having said that, I tried to brush it all off, assuring myself that it was just my imagination or the creaking of an old house. But the disturbances only grew worse and worse. I started to feel a constant presence in the house. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched all the time. So one night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open, which was strange because I've slept with my door fully secured since I was in grade school. I was sure that I had locked it before going to bed, but now it was wide open. I nervously sat up in bed and scanned the room for intruders, but there was nothing there. As I lay back down, I chuckled to myself thinking, what a bitch I am. Just then, I felt something brush past my leg. It was icy cold, and I could feel the hairs on my arms and neck stand up. I froze, unable to move, realizing I actually was a bitch. As I felt the cold presence linger for what felt like an eternity, I asked God to help me through this situation. Looking back at the situation, it didn't last more than a few moments before vanishing. Things continued to worsen from there. My children started having terrible nightmares, and my wife and I would wake up with scratches on our bodies. We tried to ignore it and carry on with our lives, but it only got worse. One day, I decided to do some research on the history of the house, and what I discovered was terrifying. It turned out that the house had been used as a funeral home, and many bodies had been there. The previous owners had experienced similar disturbances and had to move out. The spirits of the dead were still lingering in the house, and they didn't want us there. They would move objects to block our paths and trap us inside. Every night, we would hear the sounds of footsteps and doors opening and closing on their own. It was like living in a nightmare. One night, as my family and I were sitting in the living room, we heard a loud banging at the front door. We were all too scared to move, but the banging continued. It was so loud that it felt like the door was going to break down any moment. I knew I had to do something, so I slowly made my way to the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I felt a cold breeze brush past me. It was so strong that it nearly knocked me off my feet. The door creaked open, and I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, dressed in a white gown, with long black hair covering her face. I couldn't see her face, but I knew she was staring right at me. I tried to speak, but I was stiffened by fear. My throat felt like it was closing up. The eerie-looking woman took a step forward, and I could see that her eyes were glowing red. She reached out her hand towards me, and I felt a surge of fear and panic run through my body. Suddenly, my wife and children appeared beside me. They were screaming and crying, and I knew that we had to get out of there. My initial thought was to push past the figure, but sadly, I'm not that brave, so we all ran to the back of the house to make our escape, not looking back. We never returned to that house again, but the memories of what we experienced stayed with us forever, haunting our thoughts and revisiting us by way of our collective trauma. We later found out that the woman we saw was a spirit that had been trapped in the house for many years. The house had become her prison, and she didn't want anyone else in the cell with her. We were lucky to escape with our lives, but the memory of that night still endures. My grandma lived with me for quite some time while suffering from early to late stage dementia. It took far too long to find a good assisted living facility for her, and when we finally did, her dementia had progressed to an unsettling level. I agree with the science being expressed here, and I think your best option is to film these occurrences as others have suggested. However, in those last few months when she was at home with me, things happened that made me a tad less skeptical of the paranormal. From a different room, I frequently heard her having angry conversations with someone who wasn't there, and asking them to leave. I heard their replies, always, in an extremely threatening male voice. I know this could have been a symptom, but it was chilling to rush downstairs and see her sitting there like nothing happened. One time I watched a table lamp levitate a foot or so in the air while we watched TV and then plop back down. She looked at me, shrugged, and went back to watching. She was mostly non-verbal near the end, but would sometimes tell me very articulate stories about being haunted as a girl. When I was in high school, 23 years ago, my best friends were 2 guys and 1 other girl. We did everything together. The key thing here is that my parents knew them and knew we hung out all the time. They weren't secret friends or people I didn't want my parents to know about. There was absolutely no reason why I would choose to not tell my parents that I was going out with them somewhere. We were so close we could have been siblings. So one night my friends and I were hanging out. I can't remember what we were doing, but I know with absolute certainty that we did not go to one particular diner. When I got home later that night, my mum was mad at me. She was a pretty strict mother and always wanted exact details of where I was and who I was with. She asked me why I had lied to her about where I had been. The thing is, I didn't lie. I told her exactly where I had been. It turns out that her best friend, someone who knew me well, had gone out to eat at a diner and supposedly saw me at that diner, eating dinner with 3 people who looked just like my best friends. She had called my mum and through casual talking mentioned that she had seen me at the diner. She said that she didn't go over to me though, because she didn't want to embarrass me in front of my friends or something. But she was 100% positive that I was at that diner. I've always stood by the theory that she just saw someone who looked like me, though it's extremely weird that the people with me resembled my friends so closely. I can see how you might mix up a sighting of one person, but 4 total at the same time. Anyway, my mum spent many days trying to get me to tell her the truth about where I had been. I steadfastly refused to admit that I was somewhere that I wasn't. The weird thing is that this has gone on for years now, to the point where I am now 40 years old and my mum still brings up the time I lied to her about going to the diner, and I still refuse to admit that I was somewhere I wasn't. I'm not sure why it bothers my mum so much. I get that at the time she thought I was lying to her, but why she's still bringing it up 23 years later is beyond me. Now I'm wondering if there's something about that situation that seems weird to her, and that's why she just can't let it go. It's gotten to the point where she brings it up so often that I have started to think, maybe I was at that diner. It definitely messes with my head a bit. And then I have to shake my head and remind myself that no, I know I was not at that diner that night. As I already said, I've always thought that it was just someone who looked similar to me, while still finding it weird that the people I was supposedly with looked just like my friends. There were very distinct things about my friends that were described in detail to my mother, and that's super weird to me. So I have always just assumed that she was mistaken, that she saw me, and I have spent literally 23 years arguing about this incident with my mother. For the first time ever, I am now thinking, what if she really did see me there? Could it have been me from some parallel universe? That's so weird and a bit scary to think about after all these years. But what else could it be? Two friends and I went to stay the night at a haunted hotel, the Congress Plaza in Chicago. I slept in one bed, and they slept together in the other one. In the morning, we asked if anyone had experienced anything weird. One of my friends was being really quiet and said it was probably just a dream, I'm sure it had to be a dream, and didn't want to say what she saw. After some coaxing, she told us. She claimed to have woken up in the night and saw me standing in front of a wall across the room, in the dark. My back was turned to her so she couldn't make out my expression, but I was standing super still and silently. She said she sat up and said my name and asked me what I was doing. I didn't respond. Then she glanced over at my bed and saw me sleeping. She looked back across the room and I was no longer there. She rubbed her eyes feverishly, thinking she had imagined it. Then she went back to sleep, after convincing herself she must have been dreaming or sleepwalking. Not much rationale on the sleepwalking theory, but she didn't know how else to make sense of it. I have no idea what this is supposed to mean. All I know is that the Congress Plaza Hotel is messed up and I have no intention of visiting it again. The last few nights were a dark and anguished abyss, a never-ending torment that threatened to consume me whole. Every creak, every rustle, every flicker of movement in my dark, foreboding quarters sent shivers down my spine and left me trembling with fear. The figure, that wretched spectre that haunted my every waking moment, seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Its presence was suffocating, its gaze burning into my chest with a malevolent intensity that left me gasping for life-giving air. The tapping on my door was a harbinger of doom, a portent of the horrors that lurked just beyond my sight. It was a sound that spoke of death, of despair, of a world where hope had been extinguished like a candle in a tempest. When I finally mustered the courage to confront whatever was on the other side of the door, I was met with a darkness so deep and abiding that it threatened to swallow me whole. The growl that echoed through the stillness was like the rumble of thunder, a warning of the storm that was about to break. But when I flung the door open, there was nothing there, only the yawning emptiness of the void, an endless expanse of nothingness that seemed to stretch on forever. The whisper in my ear was a knife, cutting through the thin veil of sanity that still clung to me. It was a voice that spoke of torment, of suffering, of a fate worse than death. Even after I fled that house, I could feel the shadow of my tormentor following me, a ghostly presence that dogged my every step. The tapping never ceased, a constant reminder of my own powerlessness in the face of such overwhelming darkness. And so I am left to wander, lost and alone in a world that seems to grow darker with each passing day. The burden of my fear is a weight that I can never fully shake, a reminder that some terrors are too great to be banished with a simple exorcism. For the rest of my days I will be haunted by the spectre of that figure, a symbol of all the despair and hopelessness that this world can offer. When I was in middle school, I regularly visited a friend's apartment where she lived with her mum. Her mum was cool and let us party there after school, and she was always at work for long hours. There was a group of us there, maybe 6 people or so. Everyone was in the living room except for this couple who were in the mum's bedroom with the door closed and lights off. We had all gotten pretty baked. I had just made myself a snack and was walking to my friend's bedroom, which was right past the mum's room where the couple was. As I walked past the mum's bedroom door, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the door opening from the inside and a partial face of what looked identical to my friend's mum. I didn't think anything of it since there were so many people in the small apartment, and kept walking and sat in my friend's room. A minute later, the girl who had been screwing around in that bedroom came out and yelled at me, and asked me why I had kicked the door open. I told her I saw someone come out of there, and she was adamant that I had walked by and kicked the door open. The more I thought about it, the weirder it was. I thought she was messing with me at first, but the person I saw didn't look like anyone that was there in the house at the time. They looked so much like my friend's mum. If it were her, It would have meant that the she had somehow snuck back into the apartment after being gone for hours, hid in her room in the dark for over an hour, while this couple was messing around in her bed, accidentally been seen by me as I walked by, then discreetly left the bedroom and passed the living room, which was full of people, to get out of the front door. There was only one way in and out of her apartment. I always thought it was maybe a ghost, but now that I've seen so many stories like this, I'm thinking maybe a doppelganger. I stopped hanging out over there the next year, so I don't know if anything else weird like that happened again. Pretty creepy memory. I was walking home from a late shift at work when I noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. I picked up my pace and tried to shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against my neck and I spun around to find no one there. My heart racing, I continued on my way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. As I neared my house, I saw a figure standing on my front porch. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, with long, tangled hair covering her face. I froze in terror, unsure of what to do. The woman slowly raised her head to reveal empty eye sockets and a gaping mouth. She let out a blood-curdling scream, and I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I finally arrived at my doorstep, panting and sweating, I fumbled with my keys and burst inside. I turned on all the lights and locked every door and window, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what that woman was or what she wanted, but I hope I never have to encounter her again. I had 2 experiences following each other, which is strange because I don't experience many paranormal encounters. My mum and I were cooking in the kitchen when we heard a knock at the sliding door and my dad yelling "hello" in the exact way he always does when he wants us to open it for him. His voice, tone and rhythm was exact and familiar. So my mum tells me to go open the door for my dad, and I go to check, but no one is at the door. I walk into the kitchen to tell my mum this, and just as I do, we see him drive up to the gate through the kitchen window. We live on a farm, so the gate is quite far from the house. It couldn't have been a prank, and he's not the type anyway. The next day, around the same time, my mum and I are in the kitchen again. There's another knock at the sliding door. My mum tells me to go open it for my dad, and I say something like, "It would be really creepy if there's no one there again." I'm sure you can guess, but yet again there was no one at the door. It only happened twice those 2 days after each other, but I really don't know what to make of it. I feel a bit better knowing I definitely didn't imagine it because my mum experienced it with me. Anyone else have a similar experience that they could actually explain? This happened to me about 2 years ago, around late December of 2020. I was 19 around the time. Me and my girlfriend were at my grandparents' place having a couple drinks out in the garage until it got too cold to stay out there. It was one of the coldest nights of the year, and there was a bad blizzard that night. We live in Canada, by the way. We both went back to the house around 2 a.m. She went into my room and I went out in the kitchen to cook something for us in the oven. I was on my phone standing alone out in the kitchen when my grandma and my girlfriend both walked out into the kitchen together. It was a bit strange because my grandma is never up that late, and it was even stranger that my girlfriend came out at the same time. The first thing my grandma said to me is, "Don't go back out there tonight. On a night like this, people lose their lives." I was a little bit freaked out because I was just about to head back out to the garage to grab something. I never told anyone I was going back out. My girlfriend and my grandma just stood there staring at me with the weirdest expressions I've ever seen, with very unnatural smiles that didn't seem right. My girlfriend then walked over and gave me a hug. When I grabbed her, she was ice cold. I commented about this, and when I mentioned how cold she was, her expression changed. Her smile faded, and she looked up at me with really serious, sad eyes and didn't say anything. There was something else I noticed too. She smelt like a campfire, an earthy, smoky smell. There wasn't an explanation for this, and she didn't smell like that earlier. I swear at that moment I got chills all over. There was something so off about it all, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My girlfriend whispered in my ear, "Don't go outside tonight." She walked back over to my grandma. She stood beside her with her head down and a serious expression, while my grandma was still staring at me with that weird fake smile. It was so bizarre I just stood there speechless. The wind began to literally howl outside. My grandma turned and looked at my girlfriend. "Don't mess with black magic," she said. "Nothing good is going to come from it." My girlfriend didn't say anything. She continued looking down. I stood there confused. My girlfriend looked up at me. "We have to go now," she said. They both started walking away. My grandma looked back at me for a second. "See you on the flip side," she said with that weird smile. I got another chill through my whole body when she said that. They turned the corner and left the kitchen. I stood there for a while. I didn't know what to make of it all. I decided not to go out to the garage. I'd go out and get my stuff the next morning. I stayed out in the kitchen for another 10 minutes until the food was done. I went back into my room with it. My girlfriend was in bed laying down. She got up and we put on a movie. I guess I was quiet because she asked me what's wrong. I told her everything was okay. It took me 10 minutes to say something about it because, to be honest, I was still frightened by it. I turned to her and asked why she and my grandma came out to the kitchen. The second I said that, my nose started bleeding. I ran to the bathroom and got something to stop the bleeding. When I went back in the room, I told my girlfriend everything. As you can guess, she said she never went to the kitchen, and she swore on someone's life she was in the room the whole time. She also didn't smell like smoke anymore. We went and woke up my grandma right after, and my grandma said the same thing. She actually thought we were trying to mess with her, and she didn't believe me. We were so freaked out after this, we had trouble sleeping for the rest of the night. The part that really messed my girlfriend up was when I told her about how cold she felt, and how she smelt like smoke. The only explanation we could come up with was that maybe if I went outside that night, something bad would have happened to me. Maybe the spirits of dead relatives watching over me came to me in that form, so I wouldn't be scared, and they could get the message through. The last part of it that made sense was the part about the black magic. My girlfriend just got a book about witchcraft from her friend the week prior. My girlfriend never opened the book again after this. She took what was said as a warning. I've been thinking about writing this story down for the past 2 years, and my girlfriend encouraged me to finally do it because maybe someone else out there had an experience like this. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it, especially the last thing said. See you on the flip side. My Ouija board is nothing special, just the mass-produced kind you find at toy stores. This is my most profound experience with it. Sorry, but it's going to be long. A couple of years ago, I lived on campus at SUNY New Paltz in New York, and my dorm mates had never used a Ouija board. So one night in October, I brought out mine. New Paltz is a pretty old town, and one particular area, Huguenot Street, is now a historic site, as it was settled in the mid to late 1600s. So the 5 of us put our hands on the planchette, and I started out by saying some spiel like, "We cautiously call out to any benevolent spirits that would like to communicate with us. New Paltz Town, the college campus, Huguenot Street." As soon as I said Huguenot Street, the planchette came to life under our hands. It slid to the word yes. "What is your name?" It spelled Adam. "How old are you?" Planchette went to number 8. "What years did you live?" 1829 and 1837 inches were the numbers it pointed to. Then we asked him a question that required more than a short answer. I forget what exactly. He started picking out letters, Jesu, and I started thinking, oh, this spirit is going to go on about Jesus. But as he continued, I was shocked. Jesuis. He was speaking French to us. This makes complete sense because founding families of Huguenot Street were French, yet it came as quite a shock to realize the reality of the situation through the Ouija board. I should mention that I was the only one out of all of us that knew any French, so from this point until the end of the session, I kept my eyes on the ceiling to prove to the others that none of us could be controlling the planchette. You really got the impression of a child through this spirit's energy and playfulness. It really felt like we were speaking with a child. He sometimes spoke English, mostly French. We spoke English to him, though. It was a bit weird thinking about the possibility of a language barrier between our realm and his. He told us that his father was a doctor, that he had a dog named Henry, who he loved very dearly, and some other childhood memories. We asked him if he had lived on Huguenot Street. Yes, was the reply. Where? At White Fort. We all shrugged because none of us knew Huguenot Street extremely well. There were about a dozen founding families and a whole bunch of old buildings in that area. Tough questions, but we had to ask. Adam, how did you pass away at such a young age? He responded in French as I stared at the ceiling, and my friends announced the letters. Laguer. Okay, I won't spell it all out. In French he spelled out, "The war destroyed me." Chills. All of us. Whoa. That was a huge moment for us all when I translated what he said. We also asked, "Are you at rest in the Huguenot Street Cemetery?" He confirmed that he was, and that his headstone was near a tree. Eventually the session began winding down, and the planchette moved more and more sluggishly. We had to say goodbye. It was heartwarming to talk to such a young and happy-seeming spirit, yet obviously gave us a huge case of the willies also. He gave us a lot of information. We had to look into it. When I later checked out historic sites around town, I learned the information Adam gave us had turned out to be accurate. I had always been careful about walking alone at night, especially since I had escaped an abusive relationship a few years back. But one evening, as I was heading home from a late shift at my job, I noticed two men following me. At first I tried to brush it off and tell myself that I was just being paranoid. But as I turned a corner, I could hear their footsteps getting closer and closer. My heart was pounding and I quickened my pace. I tried to stay calm and walk with purpose, hoping that they would realize I wasn't an easy target. Because in fact, I do quite feel as though I'm an easy target. I started to panic in my head, thinking they could tell I am out of my depth in regards to walking alone at night. Things just got worse because they didn't give up their pursuit of me. They kept following me, and kept following me, and made it clear that they were... Just my luck, they weren't just out for a casual stroll. As I reached my apartment building, I fumbled for my keys and quickly unlocked the door. I rushed inside and locked it behind me, relieved that I had made it home safely. But my relief was short-lived. Through the peephole, I saw the two men standing outside, looking up at my window. It was like they were waiting for me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew that I couldn't let my guard down. For the next few days I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I could sense that someone was following me. I started to feel like I was trapped in my own home and couldn't escape the constant fear and paranoia. But I refused to let my past experiences define me, and I knew that I had to take action to protect myself. I reached out to a self-defense instructor and started taking classes to learn how to defend myself in dangerous situations. I also made sure to always carry pepper spray and a personal alarm with me when I went out, and I never walked alone at night anymore. I also installed a security system in my apartment and made sure to always keep my doors and windows locked. Slowly but surely, my fear began to dissipate. I started to feel more confident and empowered, knowing that I had the tools and knowledge to protect myself if I ever found myself in a dangerous situation again. Years went by, and I never saw those two men again, but I never forgot that night and the fear that it brought me. It taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of being aware of my surroundings and taking steps to protect myself. And most importantly, it reminded me that I was strong enough to overcome my fears and reclaim my safety and security. This can be explained as just a weird coincidence, but it stuck with me for a long time because it just felt like more than that. Many years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I went Christmas shopping in a neighborhood a couple of subway stops away from where I lived. It was a weekday and not too many people were out, and I was walking around going into a few different shops I'd never been to before. I walked into a little vintage shop, and the person behind the desk looked up and said, "Oh, did you decide to come back for something?" I was confused, and she said, "Weren't you in here a few minutes ago?" I clarified that no, I had in fact never been there before, and she must have seen someone who looked like me. I looked around, bought a hat, and kept walking down the street. A couple doors down, I saw a pet store. I didn't have any pets, but thought I could find some cat toys for my friends who have cats. When I walked in, the person behind the desk said, "Oh, you're back." I was thinking, no? He said the same thing that the woman in the vintage store had said, that I'd been in a few minutes ago. I guess it was probably just someone who looked like me, a petite young woman with short red hair, and happened to go into the same random stores, but it still made the hairs on my neck stand on end. We must have looked a lot alike for two different strangers to notice and comment on it. The funny thing is, I do actually have a twin, but we're fraternal, and he's a man a foot taller than me, and would consequently never be mistaken as me by other people. Here is a story of when something mimicked me. I was working in an old office building that was known for being haunted. It's one of the oldest buildings in town, and everyone that has worked there has seen or experienced something. One day we were preparing for an event at the office. I was upstairs grabbing stuff and walked downstairs. Took like a minute. Two co-workers looked confused and asked how it was possible that I got the supplies from upstairs when I had just walked into a downstairs office. Turns out they watched me walk from a back hallway and into a back office. This is on the back side of the building. The stairs were in the center of the building. They were confused by that because I had said I was going upstairs but obviously just made a loop downstairs. I told them I didn't make the loop, that I went to the top of the stairs, grabbed the supplies and came right back. I walked back into the front room seconds after they swear they watched me walk into a back office. The area is known to have drug users, so I thought maybe someone had broken in through the back. We checked and no one was in the office. They swear it was me. Same clothes and everything. My dad got mad at me when I didn't wave at him when he saw me in my car at a stoplight. He said we made eye contact and it was me driving my same car, but I didn't acknowledge him at all. He thought I was intentionally ignoring him for some reason. We have a good relationship and I'd never do that. It wasn't unusual for me to be at that intersection, except I was at work an hour drive from where he was. I wasn't even in his town that whole week. He swears it was me. We both are shocked at this event because my dad is a logical guy with no inkling for imaginative fairy tales. He wouldn't make up a sighting like that to be funny or for shock value. And he knows I wouldn't treat him that way, then lie about it. We just don't have that sort of relationship. We don't know what to make of this. A friend's grandmother was on vacation in Germany. Just to note, the grandmother is American. She was in a crowded town square somewhere when another American tourist, a man who was a complete stranger, approached and greeted her enthusiastically like she knew him. He was shocked that she was there and hadn't told him she was going to be there at the same time as him. She apologized politely and said she didn't know who he was and that he must be mistaken. The man then started to get upset that she was acting this way, accusing her of trying to get out of spending time with him in Germany. She continued to explain she wasn't who he said, his aunt or something, and he just got more angry. Finally, her travel partner came and tried to settle things. Finally, they just walked away into the crowd. She said he was absolutely certain that she was his relative. So weird. The first time I experienced sleep paralysis, I was 13 or so. I went upstairs to take a short nap after school before going out. I remember suddenly opening my eyes and being unable to move my body. I was overcome with a horrifying sensation, like I was going to die or something. I then looked at my TV with my eyes and saw an odd black figure standing beside my bed. At this point my heart was pounding. I turned my eyes to my right and saw a stereotypical Grim Reaper, about 8 feet tall, scythe and all, scribbling something down on parchment and then looking up on occasion. This went on for about 60 seconds and I wanted to scream in sheer terror, but I could not even speak. Finally I was able to move and the Grim Reaper vanished, and I jumped up from my bed and ran downstairs screaming. Then a few months later I read a book by Carl Sagan and discovered that what I experienced was entirely normal, and I was not insane. I was relieved. I have since experienced sleep paralysis about 6 more times, but they have not been accompanied with hallucinations every time. I always get the feeling of impending doom, however. It wouldn't be so bad if the experience wasn't so terrifying. I can handle the physical discomfort, but the emotional stress of the panic attack that comes with it. Sheesh. No thanks. It happens a lot when I'm uncomfortable with where I am, or something in my life. One time it happened, I was moving out of my parents' house. I woke up and couldn't move, and my whole body was vibrating. I honestly thought I was being abducted by aliens. Too much X-Files. Years later, it happened again at a hotel on a road trip, and I felt a presence near me. It was very hostile. It happened a couple more times on the road trip, and each time the presence would become more tangible. Dark, shaped like a man, evil. The last one, this presence was holding me down. With scares like that, it's no wonder early man developed religion. My religious friends said that it was a demon attacking me while I am between this world and whatever realm we float off to when we are asleep. They suggested I ask God to help me when I feel the sensation again. They told me whenever they feel an attack, they mentally ask God to take the demon away from them, and it actually stops, almost instantly. I haven't tried that yet, not because I am not open to it. After all, if there's no God, then calling out to him for help won't have any less effect than the usual methods I use to come out of that scary state. And if there is a God, again, no harm in asking for his help. The worst that will happen is he will deny me because I wasn't sure if he's real or not. But honestly, I just became so panicked I forgot what to do, so that's why I can't report any first-hand results. But I thought I would share that theory, in case it helps anyone else hearing this. If asking God for help will bring me out of it faster, no harm done in trying. Around 15 years ago, when both of my kids were toddlers, I was putting them to bed one night, and my son was adamant that he wear his favourite red race car pyjamas. I happily obliged, helped him change into them, and tucked him into bed. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a friend who had come over to chat and catch up. The way that my apartment was set up, you could see my kids' bedroom doorway from the kitchen table. My friend and I were talking for a while before we were suddenly interrupted by the sound of my son screaming. We both turned and looked at the bedroom doorway and saw my son standing there loudly shrieking and wearing his green pyjamas with airplanes on them. Everything inside of me was screaming that this was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end and a cold shiver shot down my spine. My friend and I stared wordlessly at each other for a second. We both knew that my son couldn't change his pyjamas by himself yet. We looked back at the doorway and my son was gone. We ran to the bedroom and found him tucked in bed, still sleeping peacefully in his red race car pyjamas. My friend asked me if I saw him standing there in his green airplane pyjamas, and I confirmed that I had. My friend freaked out and left. I slept on my kids' bedroom floor that night to make sure nothing happened to them. My friend and I still talk about it to this day. It's one of the craziest things that's ever happened to me. My son, of course, doesn't remember any of it, but he loves hearing the story of how his body double scared the crap out of us. Back when I lived with my roommate in my old house, I experienced something eerie like this. I don't know if it was a mimic, to be honest. I don't know what it was. I was extremely skeptical of ghosts until I lived in that house. And I actually joined this thread to learn more because of what we were experiencing in that place. We only lived in that house for about 9 months because the things that happened there were so crazy. Anyway, the only story I have about a mimic-related scenario is, one night I was home alone getting ready for a date because my roommate usually spent the night at her boyfriend's house. While I was putting my makeup on, I heard her voice clearly telling my dog to get out of the trash from the kitchen. So I ran out to the kitchen, and sure enough, my dog had gotten into the trash. I only realized that I was home alone after I moved my dog out of the room and started cleaning. Total spine shivers. That was one of the last experiences I had before we said, forget this, and moved out of that place. Okay, so a very long time ago, I read that a mimic was a bad omen spirit, or one that has bad intentions, I've had several experiences with what I believe to be mimics, but I think they're a whole separate kind of entity. The most recent encounter was last year, just before my wife caught COVID and almost died. It sounded like her one day, my grandmother 3 days, and like a whole conversation and footsteps of my cousin and aunt for nearly a week. It lasted about 2 months. I've had other experiences with them sounding like both of my parents and other family members, all of whom are alive, by the way, right before bad stuff happened. Night terrors are so scary. You try to wake up, try to move a muscle, but you can't. Sometimes you feel like you're floating in the air, or at times like something is on top of you. You feel terrible, depressing anxiety in general. You may think someone is surely going to notice you're in distress, that they are soon going to rush through that door to rescue you and bring you back to the land of the living. But nobody comes. No one can tell you're shouting as loud as you can, but your voice is desperately trapped inside your own head. You beg someone, anyone, whoever is around, screaming their name, wondering why they can't hear you. You don't always realize that your mouth is still closed, not moving, and no sounds are coming from your body. To anyone walking into the room, you seem to be peacefully resting, and they wouldn't want to disturb your rest prematurely. There are no signs that you should be awakened or checked on. You're stuck in a suffocating abyss, waiting for help, or relief from the shadowy figures that oppress the air in the room, making it impossible to take in a breath so that you can feel alive again. You think, is this what it feels like when you die? You can hear and see things going on around you, but you can't interact with anyone. You see your partner in the bed next to you, soundly and peacefully dreaming. You can sense the temperature of the air in the room, the cold, still atmosphere whispering in your ears. You are so stressed at the thought that no one will bring you out of this miserable, stifling pressure as you wonder how you can make yourself move and breathe again. As you try so very hard to breathe, you think, maybe if I can wiggle my toes or my fingers, I can gain control of my body again. So you put all your concentration into getting a tiny bit of movement back to your limbs, trying your best to ignore the loud, otherworldly whispers and the tightness in your chest. Trying with everything, to pretend you don't see the shrouded dark figures looming over you, grinning without a face, shouting without a discernible voice, oppressing your senses and mind with the strange, perverted gazes. Those accusatory looks coming from a blurry face with no eyes. And suddenly, you feel a toe miraculously jerk, a finger wiggle, and like you've been holding your breath underwater for much too long, you gasp in a burst of shallow breaths, nearly hyperventilating at the thought you may have never come out of that trance-like coma you were temporarily in. Those few seconds or terror, maybe minutes even, feel like an eternity, trapped in your own useless body at the mercy of chance. And then, when you awaken, who can you tell? Who will listen to your unbelievable story and believe how intense and horrifying the feeling was? Who will not shrug it off as just sleep paralysis? No worries, you're just a little stressed, they say flippantly. Who will treat you like they truly believe you are not just making a big deal out of nothing? So you keep it to yourself, dreading the thought of it happening again, hoping the little prayer you mutter under your breath each night is enough to protect you from the terrors again, hoping there really is some all-powerful being out there who will hear you and save you, even if you can't see or hear them yourself. Just like those shrouded figures who loomed grotesquely over you, who crossed over from their bizarre realm of mysteries into your own as you slept unsuspectingly. Tonight, you continue your nightly ritual of quickly mumbling the words under your breath, feeling ridiculous and childish as you hope this possible heavenly being takes pity on your lost soul and accepts your subpar prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. Once, during an episode of sleep paralysis, I had a vision of a church in stained glass. I have heard from other people's experiences that this is not uncommon. Another time I had it while napping in the back seat of a car. My friend was in the front seat at the time, also napping. While under paralysis, I tried to let him know what was going on because I wanted him to save me from it. So I tried to stick out my hand and let him know what was going on, but I couldn't speak, so he didn't know what I wanted. Then I tried to write on my hand, but it wasn't getting through. Man, that one was for you folks who think it only happens when you sleep on your back. No way, it can happen in any situation. Even just a short nap, where you haven't even been asleep long enough to be dreaming yet. Finally, I woke up and told him what happened. He was freaked out. And of course, I didn't actually get my hand up at all. That's the thing about sleep paralysis. You think that, with all the mental effort, you might have moved a muscle, but in reality you haven't at all. It is the creepiest sensation, like you're drugged or something, like you can't control your own body. And it's such a helpless feeling. It's even worse when you're around other people when it happens. You're like begging them to help you, but nobody can hear you or figure out if anything is wrong. It's so frustrating and panic-inducing. I just can't. I had a sleep paralysis experience that has one creepy element I can't explain. Quick background, I was experimenting with high doses of melatonin, an over-the-counter neurohormone that aids you with sleep. I did this in an attempt to intensify my dreams. It's a common side effect of melatonin, and one I greatly enjoyed. One night, at a bread and breakfast with my girlfriend, I had a classic episode of sleep paralysis. Paralyzed, terrified, and afraid of something malignant in the room, I eventually fell back asleep, but it was really, truly terrifying while it lasted. Here's the weird part. When I woke up the next morning and looked in the bathroom mirror, I had a bright red handprint on my chest. It was very distinct, and the fingers were long, and there were 6 of them. 5 fingers and 1 thumb. My girlfriend and I tried to come up with an explanation, but nothing fit. I couldn't twist my hand into the position, so it wasn't like I'd been sleeping on my hand. The positioning was not something I could match, even with stretching and contorting. Believe me, I tried. And the imprint was so distinct, it looked like it had been painted on. It faded after a few minutes. I have no idea what caused it, nor have I found any plausible explanation after thinking about it over the course of 10+ years. It is truly a mystery. I wish I had an explanation, but it is what it is. I used to have sleep paralysis all the time. I think the creepiest was waking up to see a man with a pale face and burning red eyes grabbing me by the collar and smiling with this sinister grin. Well, I swear I was awake. I mean, I know what it feels like to be completely awake. And I remember not being able to close my eyes for like 10 of the longest seconds of my life. About 3 years later, I was at a party, and people were talking about weird things they've seen like ghosts and such. Some girl I never met described in detail the same figure doing the same thing to her niece. Figure that one out, folks. Burning orange eyes, pale, dead-looking skin, grabbing her collar and hovering above her like parallel to her body. It was the exact same experience I had. I've also heard them called hypnagogic hallucinations, however you say it. Some other experiences I've had include busts of hooded monk looking mad while floating beside my bed, a little girl waving her finger at me in the corner of the room, looking outside my window and seeing everything in this weird, ghastly white coloration, feeling someone sitting down on my bed and finding no one there when I looked, then feeling it get back up again. Let's see. One time I woke up and sat up in bed, motioned my head and body like I was trying to get close to someone's face, though no one was there, and said, "I'm not afraid of you. I know I was awake. I just had no control over my body or thoughts." The phrase didn't enter my head. I just leaned forward and said it. In life, I also feel like there are people in the room with me at times. I can even point to where they're standing, but no one is there. I just sense a really strong presence. I know seeing is believing, but it is so vivid in some other sense. That is hard to explain to people who have never felt this feeling. You don't actually see anyone there, but you sense their presence so strongly. It feels like a vision, even while your rational mind understands that it is not. Another time I was just talking to a friend, and while we were talking, he saw a glowing white figure float past my window. He had never seen anything like that before. He's a very rational army dude. I kind of thought it might be me, like I'm prone to some weird paranormal activity. Another time I was watching a movie with this same guy, and he started clenching his fists and rocking back and forth, breathing really strangely. It took us like 5 minutes to snap him out of it. Other than those 2 times when I was nearby, he's never had any sort of experience like that. I'm telling you, this dude was not the type to be on it like that. Nowadays, I mostly just feel a presence around me, and don't see much. I do hear voices sometimes when I'm about to fall asleep, and sometimes I hear the most beautiful choir imaginable singing songs. That's the only good experience though. The rest are pretty freaky. I guess it sounds like I'm schizophrenic or something, but I assure you these things seldom happen. And I'm considered to be a pretty stoic and rational person in others' eyes. I am not the only one that has had experiences that most would consider paranormal, although mine aren't nearly so dramatic. My mother-in-law used to live in an old house that she would describe as haunted. She travelled a lot, so when she was out of town, my then girlfriend, current wife, would stay there and take advantage of the privacy. The house would feel fairly typical and inviting during the day, but once the sun went down, the feel of the place would change from airy to oppressive. Oftentimes we'd hear footsteps in empty rooms and scratching at the walls. A few times we'd find the front door that had been shut, latched and chained to be flung wide open. It was more perplexing and unsettling rather than scary most of the time. One night we had a bad night. We were sleeping when we started hearing thuds and scratching throughout the house. She thought someone had broken into the house and got up to peek out the window. As she approached the window, the blinds flew up violently and hit her in the face, which was about a good 2 to 3 feet from the window at the time. The noises kept getting louder, so we decided it would be best to leave. As we were walking out the door, a liquor bottle flew across the room and hit her in the back of the head. It was about a month before we mustered up the nerve to go back. Schizophrenics can't make other people witness or experience their own delusions. People will forever debate whether these things are rooted in biology, the paranormal, or some combination of the two. Where do you stand on the matter? I have these episodes often. Weird and terrifying dreams, feelings of strangulation and impending death. Typically my wife ends up waking me up because I am gasping for breath. The weirdest thing is that most often, the setting of my nightmare is the same as my current environment. I just transition into sleep at some point. As a result, these nightmares are vivid, realistic, and quite horrifying. The most terrifying of these nightmares happened to me about 3 years ago. I dreamed that I was in a long hallway of what appeared to be some sort of mental hospital. I walked down a long, dimly lit corridor of locked rooms, each with a sturdy door with a tiny observation window on it. I approached one particular door, which had a bloody fingerprint on it, and peered in. It contained a disturbed bed and otherwise was empty, but suddenly I had the feeling that I was no longer alone. I looked down the hall in time to see a shadow in the shape of a human figure walking toward me. I stood fixed in terror, and the shadow walked through me. I felt myself begin to die, as if my body suddenly quit functioning. I can barely describe the sensation. It was a mental and physical absence of the will to live, like a void opened within me. I was terrified. I was awakened shortly after by my wife. I was seemingly unable to breathe and was struggling about in bed. When I got up to use the restroom, I was shocked to notice a faint brownish fingerprint on the door that I didn't remember seeing before. I called my wife into the hall to inspect it, wanting to hear her theory on whose fingerprint it was and if it could be blood, some type of sauce or paint. She said she never noticed it, but it looked pretty dry and faint, like it had been there a while. Weird. I used to do it on purpose to try and lucid dream. I used to be huge into sleep and dreaming and read a few books on lucid dreams. Turns out sleep paralysis is a great way to go straight from consciousness into a dream with absolutely no lapse in between. This is a documented scientific fact. Our brain paralyzes us before we hit REM sleep. Sleep paralysis is basically so you don't move while dreaming. Your eyes move, they are not paralyzed. But if anything else moved, you might harm yourself. People commonly experience sleep paralysis when waking up from a dream too fast and the brain not realizing it quite in time. Sleep paralysis is totally harmless and happens to you every single night. You just don't know it. That being said, some people can get stuck in sleep paralysis for hours, being fully aware of their situation but being powerless to stop it. That is where the feeling of powerlessness and helplessness takes over for most. In sleep paralysis, I've floated above my bed and flipped over. This is where out-of-body experiences are reported, and they're all attributed to sleep paralysis. Also, people claiming to be abducted by aliens is due to this being a huge factor. I'd say most paranormal activity that occurs around sleeping time is sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis and sleeping in general is a cool subject. Such mysterious things our brains are capable of doing that distort reality and fantasy. After all, our brain cannot actually tell the difference between the two. Why do you think PTSD is so debilitating to those who experience flashbacks? It's not just the memory of the traumatic event, but also the body's physical response, as if it is actually happening, even though it truly isn't. The brain just can't tell the difference and sends signals to your body to react in a fight or flight response. Paralysis is basically the same thing, even though it is no doubt a horrifying feeling to witness a scary figure or even a demon attacking you. Just try to remember your brain is playing tricks on you and your body is reacting accordingly. Try to remind yourself that it's not real, it's simply a dream you are having while your eyes are open, distorting your sense of reality. I hope that helps somebody. I experienced night terrors quite a bit during my college years. About 5 years ago, at my parents' house, I fell asleep in the evening and woke up around 9 p.m. to find that while I could look around and hear my folks talking downstairs, I could not move a muscle. I was so freaked out that I tried to scream over and over again, which was about as loud as the rustle of toilet paper. It lasted a few minutes, or so it seemed, and then I slowly regained my movement. I've joked about it to friends, telling it like a ghost story. I really had no idea what was going on. At first I nearly thought it was something supernatural, as I would wake up paralyzed and see figures standing off in the edges of view, while hearing whispering voices. One time it was extremely vivid where I woke to see a little girl sitting at the edge of my bed, and an older woman standing a ways off with her back to me. The little girl said something to me, but after fighting out of the paralysis, I couldn't remember what she had said. After a bit of research, I came across one theory that made logical sense. The theory was that lack of REM sleep could cause it to kick in prematurely, locking out motor ability and dreaming before you're physically asleep. I'm not sure how plausible that is, but it's the most logical explanation I've heard. At the time, I was living on probably 4 hours of sleep a night and drinking coffee by the pot. I sleep more and drink less nowadays, but I still experience it mildly from time to time. Does anyone else experience this more when they binge watch scary movies or content online? Once, when I was about 4, I had some sort of nightmares and fled to my parents' room. They made me a bed of blankets next to their bed. I was drifting off on the floor next to my dad's side when I swear I heard him say loudly and clearly, "I'm gonna kill you." I lay there in utter terror for I don't know how long. More recently I was taking a quick nap in my car before doing a long bike ride. I woke up, honestly, probably snored myself awake. My seat was reclined and my head was tilted back a bit, so I probably was snoring like mad and having a hard time breathing. I lay there for what felt like minutes, unable to move. The car felt stiflingly hot. Although it was warm, the windows were cracked, and I simply couldn't breathe. I was convinced that I was asphyxiating. I lay there and focused very hard on breathing. I slowly was able to take shallow breaths. I took deeper and deeper breaths until things returned to normal, and I fully woke up. Only now have I associated the first childhood episode with the more recent occurrence, other incidents. I awoke and watched shadowy figures stealing things from my bedroom as a child. I was afraid to do anything, certain they would kill me. I eventually drifted off and, of course, awoke to find everything as I had left it. Another time I woke up in the morning and was convinced the Canadian Mountie figure that my grandparents gave me was moving on the windowsill. I awake on occasion to see a rat running across the ceiling or some other unidentifiable critter running through the room. Shivers are running through my spine. Oh man, now I am so doomed for getting to sleep tonight. I used to deal with sleep paralysis all the time in high school. Oftentimes, there would be a hooded Grim Reaper-type character standing over me. He would envelop me in some kind of bluish force field and lift me up off the bed. I had the feeling this dude was evil incarnate, but I couldn't move or scream. Too scary, bruh. Other times I was just paralyzed in bed and I felt like there was an ominous presence, but didn't see anything. After reaching a certain level of panic, I would wake up. It happened fairly often, so I started to be able to control it if I concentrated. I got to where I could move, though it felt like there was 1,000 pounds crushing me. Usually I could just flop out of my bed and crawl along the floor. One time I made it to the next room. This also led to some out-of-body experiences, usually just floating above myself in my room. A few times I was able to cruise around the house or neighborhood. At this point, it started to become less scary and more fun, although there was almost always a bit of an uneasy feeling to it. Eventually, I started to have some lucid dreams. I would be able to walk around and consciously interact with the environment. Usually I still felt weighted down and would have to struggle intensely to walk around. The most memorable time, I ended up in my buddy's basement. There were a bunch of children sitting around. They all looked at me like, "What on earth are you doing here?" One little girl in particular looked at me with this really strange expression. Then she just started laughing. Then I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like, "You're moving with your auntie and uncle to Bel Air." True story, bruh. Sleep paralysis happened to me rather frequently when I was very young, under 6 years old, but I apparently have grown out of it. I can't recall it happening after I was perhaps 9 or 10. I'm 26 now. Whenever it would take place, I could clearly see an outline of a body from the waist up, almost like a police chalk line around a dead body, but just a black background, and a thick white hollow outline of a body. And from the bottom of the torso up, the outline was filling with red on both sides evenly. It was happening very slowly. I seem to remember hauntingly scary sounds echoing in the background, but nothing specific. I got the distinct impression that when the red filled up all the way to the top of the body or head, I would die. So I remember being absolutely terrified. If I tried really hard, I could choose to make it stop, and then I would become semi-aware of lying in bed with my eyes closed, usually in the morning with the sunlight coming in. But I couldn't move at all. I couldn't open my eyes, and I couldn't make a sound. If I relaxed and stopped trying to wake up, I would go back to seeing the body outline again. I was constantly in this bizarre state of limbo between wanting to relax, to alleviate the anxiety and panic setting in, but then having to face the scary figure in my periphery, or trying desperately to wake up while fighting through the stifling feeling of suffocation and heaviness in my body. I don't know which state was more terrifying, but it really felt like it took forever to somehow shake myself out of that dreary, foreboding sensation. I hope you never experience anything like that. Bruh. The first time this happened to me was absolutely the most disturbing thing that ever happened to me or my family. When I was a little boy, around 6 years old, I had fallen asleep on the couch, on my back. I remember having that feeling you get when something bad is about to happen, and suddenly realizing I couldn't move. Then there was a sensation of something moving up my legs towards my chest, Suddenly there was this heavy weight on my chest, and my eyes opened to see this thing I can only describe as a demon, sitting on me grinning like a madman. The thing wrapped its claws around my neck and started strangling me. I finally woke up to my mother shaking me violently, screaming for me to wake up. I had stopped breathing and was starting to turn blue. Needless to say, it scared the crap out of both of us. The one thing that really sticks out was how tired I was, like I had really been struggling to move with every ounce of my strength. Since then, I started experiencing it almost weekly. Let me tell you a few of the hallucinations that I do remember. Like a lot of people have mentioned, I saw a ghostly person or demonic creature sitting on my chest choking me, waking up out of breath. How about this? Demon dogs from Resident Evil bursting through the door. Yeah, that one is real fun. I have even seen a floating head coming at me from the corner of the room. And the one that frightened me real bad, being paralyzed on the bed and watching a small clownish gnome pull himself up out of my heat register on the floor, hobble over, climb up the bed sheets, and get right in my face before I woke up screaming. Although I have sleep paralysis fairly regularly, like 2 or 3 times a month nowadays, I thankfully have no more fearful hallucinations. My wife has figured out when this is happening. My breathing becomes very erratic, and I can usually shake free of the paralysis enough to move my hand. Usually, she will wake me up and make me turn on my side. I usually wake in the morning feeling like I've had no sleep at all. It always makes me think of those books from childhood, scary stories to tell in the dark. There was one about a witch that turns a man into a horse at night and rides him around all night. Then when she turns him back into a human, he wakes up exhausted, because he got no rest all night. Makes me wonder if any of those creepy stories were based on sleep paralysis experiences. It's funny this macabre subject came up when it did. I actually experienced this in a very intense way just a couple of days ago. The experience at the time. It was early in the morning, right when the sun was coming up, so there was a very small amount of light in my room. I woke up suddenly and felt like something had jumped inside my chest, or maybe jumped out of it, and I grabbed my chest. I then felt like a demon came out of my nose and mouth, like smoke, and had the appearance of a long black ribbon wafting about in the wind, but with a fish, specifically a barracuda-type head. This thing was undulating in front of my face for what seemed like forever, and I kept having the experience of leaning up in bed toward my fan, and this thing stayed the exact same distance. This happened several times, except I never had the experience of leaning back, just forward. It was as if I jumped from leaning forward to being back down instantly. Finally, I became more awake and all this stopped, and the demon disappeared. What I think happened? I did not go back to sleep and wake up later. Just after this happened is when I got up, so this wasn't just a regular dream that I mistook for something unique. It certainly was unique, whatever it was. That being said, I think that I was halfway between being awake and asleep. I think my eyes were open so that I was seeing my actual room, and that my dream was being superimposed on reality. I believe that the movements such as my hands to my chest and the leaning forward were actually virtual sensations, and that I was completely frozen, because when I did come around I was in the laying down position I started with, the position I kept reverting to, from the leaning forward position in the dream. I would like to say that I am an atheist, and I don't really think there is anything supernatural about this. The stress from recent events in my life is what led to the intense and vivid nature of this experience. The trigger for it was that I went to New Orleans for the weekend and ended up doing stupid things and getting arrested. I had to pay a bunch of money to a lawyer, and I have been really stressed out about it, and it has really made me think about life in the last couple of days. This experience and several others that I regret have been weighing me down a little lately. I have also had straight up, just frozen in place type dreams in the past, although not as excruciating as this one. I do think I was frozen the whole time, even if it didn't feel like it. If anyone has any opinions or thoughts, please let me know, even if they are religious, although I don't think I will agree with those. But logic is logic, and I'm not biased against any logical explanations, whether based in science, religion, Spiritual or philosophical theories. There are great things that people can learn from religions, like how to be charitable and kind to others, how to be less selfish, and how to care for the community. I'm an open-minded person. In Arabic language and culture, what we call sleep paralysis is jathum, which basically comes from a word which means to put load on. It is believed in Arab or Islamic culture that if one goes to bed and does not wake up for morning prayers on time, a jinn named Jathum will sit on your chest, causing that paralysis and pressure when you try to inhale. A jinn is what we equate to a demon, I guess. That's where you get the concept of a genie from. You know, the one who lives in a lamp. It happened to me twice. It's a freaky experience. I woke up knowing someone was there but couldn't move around to see him. I was scared silly too. Strangely enough, I thought in my mind that it was 5:15 a.m. I stayed paralyzed for a good 5 minutes, and when I calmed down, checked the clock, it was exactly 5:20. That seemed very strange and unsettling. I definitely seem prone to night terrors because it happens to me often. It happens so regularly. I thought for a long time that it was a normal occurrence for most people, and that everyone else experienced it often too. Once I began telling people about it, thinking we would exchange stories on how to cope or get through it more easily. I began to get some interesting feedback. Firstly, very few people told me they experienced this frequently, if at all. One day I explained this to a lady in my class, and the next day she gave me a book called something like The Secret to the Soul, Guide to Out-of-Body Experiences. According to this book, the secret to leaving your body was through sleep paralysis. It said once in this state, focus on the ceiling and leave your body. Basically a lucid dream, simple enough. So I was pretty sure I knew how to induce sleep paralysis. Step 1, sleep in late. Step 2, wake up for a short period of time. 3, go back to sleep sleeping on my back. So one morning that gnarly buzz droned through my body. I was in sleep paralysis mode. Immediately I remembered the book. I began trying my hardest to just get out of the bed. I managed to fall off the bed, crawl up to my mirror and look at myself, before exiting my room and walking into my kitchen. No one was there, but I saw a giant pizza box on my counter. Then all of a sudden I woke up. Turns out, I never physically left my bed at all. This has happened to me every time I tried to leave my bed during sleep paralysis. Also, that giant pizza box was never there when I actually went into the kitchen. That was the most terrible part for me. I could use a free box of delicious pizza. I'd like to start with this disclaimer. As a kid, I thought it was more of a creepy, funny joke than anything when I first bought a spirit board. It, in fact, was not. I was 11, my sister was 10, and my aunt 16. My aunt used to stay with us most of the summer. We loved watching Lance Stewart. I know, ridiculous, but this was in 2016. We thought his videos were scary and crazy, which I now know are flukes and staged for views. So we convinced my mum to get us one. My mum was not okay with it at first, but we begged her and said she could play it with us, so as to ease her discomfort about us getting into things that she thought might be harmful. Our logic was that if our mother saw for herself how stupid and harmless the game was, she wouldn't mind us playing it on our own. I regret it now. So we got it, and we waited for my other 2 younger siblings to go to bed so the 4 of us could play. Again, it was myself, my 10-year-old sister, my teen aunt, and my mother. We go into my mum's room, lock the door, and start playing by the directions. My mum made sure to always say, we are only looking for contacts within our family. We are not accepting any other spirits to speak with. My older sister came through, who passed away before she was born, as in, she was my mother's miscarriage. What's your name? We asked. Rosie. That was her name. For a while, I thought it was my teen aunt because she loved to play pranks back then. But then my mom asked, what's the song I always used to sing to you in my belly? And it answered precisely. My mom started bawling hysterically, and that's when I knew this wasn't fake. She was so happy. I was sobbing too. It felt good though. It felt peaceful. A few weeks go by and we decide to play it again. This story will stick with me for the rest of my life. Okay, so we're all playing, and someone in our family supposedly crosses over. We ask for its name. It tells us the name is KM. We were all confused why it said initials, but we thought we knew who it might be. We had thought it was my mum's sister, Karen, so we got excited about that. We're like, "Hey, is that you, Karen?" The planchette moves to the word no. Now, we were so confused about who it might be. My mum asks, "Are you on my dad's side of the family then?" She was referring to my grandfather. It answered yes, so we immediately were perplexed, and couldn't think of who on that side of the family had those initials. My aunt then asks, "When did you die?" The answer said, "Tonight." When I tell you, the four of us instantly became terrified, like you just don't understand how scared we were. She questioned further, "How did you die tonight?" It answered with one word, motorcycle. We were actually scared and confused at this point, genuinely terrified. My mom politely but urgently told the spirit we didn't know them, and we said goodbye because we were too scared to continue. My little sister was damn near in tears, although we were uber creeped out. We all tried not to think too much of it, and we went to sleep, all in the living room together, because we were scared. Don't laugh at me as you read this, it was scary for real. So, now it's the next morning. Around 7:30 we wake up to my mum outside, on the front porch, which you can see from the living room. She's hysterically crying and sobbing, saying, "He's gone. He died last night." Me, my aunt and my sister are staring at each other in absolute disbelief. We didn't know what was going on or who she was talking about. Well, it turns out, my mum's little cousin Kenny, whose last name certainly started with an M, died the previous night in a motorcycle accident. We literally knew he died before anyone even knew. And for some reason I feel kind of guilty because personally I didn't know him, but it felt like a sign he wanted us to know. Perhaps he thought we would notify their other family about his condition. Geez, Ouija boards are scary and traumatic, to be honest. We have not played since that night, and moved out of that house because it was starting to get weird. My mother often found herself in a depressed mood, for no logical reason. The house just had a dreary gloom about it that you couldn't quite explain. My aunt would have nightmares when she would come to visit. My sister and I kept hearing whispers and voices in the halls at night when we would come out to use the bathroom or get something from the kitchen. It always felt like someone was watching or lurking around when there wasn't anyone there, at least no one we could actually see. When you open yourself to an unknown, unseen world, it's scary, even if you might connect with a good spirit like my baby sister, who died before birth. You still open up the possibility of other dark beings to attach to you or the house. After we moved, the weird activities stopped. All four of us learned our lesson not to expose ourselves to these mysterious things. My mum and aunt used a Ouija board after their dad died. He had remarried, but had told his daughters that he was leaving them a few things in his will, including some money. His second wife was the executor, and was saying he hadn't left them money and whatnot. Anyway, Mum and her sister thought it was possible the money wasn't left to them after all, like second wife said, but my aunt was really strapped for cash, and they felt like it was also possible second wife was withholding info and money. After all, she did have a good motive to lie. They apparently managed to reach their dad via the Ouija board, and asked him whether he had left the money in his will. It spelt out a 3-letter acronym for a bank, and then a series of numbers. Turns out, he did have a bank account with money in it, intended for his daughters. The account matched the bank acronym and account number. This one spooked me because the details were a surprise to Mum and my aunt. You know how people theorize that Ouija boards simply reflect the subconscious thoughts of the users? We're talking about an entire bank account number here, so logically speaking, I don't know how they could have gotten that info out of thin air. The first and only time I ever used one, I was a teenager playing on a Ouija board with a friend on my back porch. I didn't know of anyone who had died, except I remembered from an old photo on the wall a great aunt called Neil. The name Neil stuck with me because it was a boy's name, so I tried to talk to great aunt Neil, But when I speak, I say without hesitation or control, Aunt Connie. I thought, that's weird. I don't have an Aunt Connie. I try again and say I'm trying to speak with, although mentally saying the name Neil, what comes out of my mouth is Aunt Connie. It was completely involuntary, very weird, but we moved on and kept playing. When my mum got home from running errands, she asked how our game was going. And I replied, it's fine, except I kept trying to talk to Great Aunt Neil, but kept saying Connie, which is so weird because I don't have an Aunt Connie. I still remember my mom's face at that moment. It turns out I did have an Aunt Connie. She was a baby who died of sudden infant death syndrome decades before I was born. My mum almost named me after her. I went on to have extreme paranormal experiences that continue to this day, actually. I think it opened a door that I haven't been able to close. The scariest things that have ever happened to me were from when I was a moody 15 to 18-year-old girl. That seemed to really energize my surroundings, and lots of scary things happened. I saw people, heard my name whispered in my ear at night multiple times, heard footsteps daily, and heard a voice mimic my father's and walk around the kitchen. That one convinced me that someone had broken into our home, and I stayed outside until my boyfriend came to get me. Of course nobody was there. My brother moved back into the family house after college, and confirmed he also heard a voice mimic our father's and walk around in the kitchen. He didn't offer this info on his own. I had to pull it out of him over dinner years later. We independently experienced this and didn't know it. In college, I saw a girl standing over my roommate's bed in the middle of the night. I woke up the next day and was like, hey, who was that watching you sleep? My roomie was like, oh, hell no. She and I still talk about it today. We were in a sorority hall at the time, so I dismissed it initially. Maybe some drunk chick wandered into our room somehow and was being a weirdo. It only hit me later that I didn't recognize her, and I couldn't see her legs. The other weirdest thing in college was someone kept getting into bed next to me, never touched me, but the mattress went down with their weight. That one spooked me so bad, so be careful with treating the paranormal realm as some silly child's game. It is not as harmless as some people would like to believe. I'm speaking from lots of horrifying, chilling experiences. When will people learn that the Ouija board is not a game, even though it is sold as such for entertainment purposes? These games are anything but, and people continuously try to summon things to come from the spiritual realm into our physical plane, without understanding the focused intention that must be implied before attempting contact and knowing what to do when things get out of hand. People, especially kids, see these rituals played out on television or in movies, and then think they can do it too, not realizing what could happen. About 2 months ago, in a now deleted post, a young man said when he was 14, he performed some sort of chanting ritual in front of his bathroom mirror. Nothing happened at first. A few days later, after he got out of the shower and approached the sink, he looked up and saw something tall, black as night, standing against the back wall that began to growl at him. To this day, 3 years later, this thing messes with him and his family. They had their home blessed, which helped for about a month. Then it started up again. They did move, but it followed them and now likes to hang out in their garage, which they only now enter during the day. During the evening, though, they consistently hear things being moved or knocked over, but they never go look to see what it is, because they know what it is. Please don't try to summon anything from the spiritual realm unless you know exactly what you're doing, and if your kids have Ouija boards, toss them out. Writing entertaining posts online or making spooky, haunting videos for internet fame and clout is not worth the mental and spiritual anguish that can be unleashed on you and your loved ones from messing around with things you don't understand. It could mean cutting your lifespan shorter than necessary. We don't encourage people to play games with guns because we know the potential dangers of doing so. Just because the Ouija board doesn't come with a cartridge of bullets doesn't mean it's not just as deadly or damaging. Please take these stories as a warning and don't make the preventable mistake of letting this type of activity enter your life. Stay safe, everyone. When I was about 12 years old, a group of friends and I decided to give a go at the old Ouija board. We weren't getting anything out of the board, and none of us were taking the experience very seriously. So out of ignorance and pure gall of a stupid 12-year-old, I sarcastically uttered, "All right, if this nonsense is so real, tell me what's going to happen to me later this evening." Out of nowhere, the board concisely tells me I'm going to be hit by a green van. Unnerved, I called bull and kind of brushed it off. The board went quiet again. So we wrap it up, say goodbye, and by this time it's nearing around 9:30, so I let my friends know I got to get home before my dad beats my behind. So I begin the 4-block walk back to my spot, and on the way back, I walk through a large park with a clear view the whole way along the adjacent road. It's quiet, no traffic in sight, as I'm about to walk across the street to a back lane that takes me straight home. And I kid you not, I swear on my great-aunt's soul, this green van, damn near, spawns out of nowhere and spanks my little butt. I wasn't run over, but that mother gave me a nice nudge that messed up my hip, and it didn't stop. It hit me and drove away. The weirdest event that's ever happened to me. Never touched a Ouija board again. This was late summer 2011. I am in a European country, so none of this was in English. I was 15 when my friend and I tried it. I drew up the Ouija board on a large piece of paper. We lit the candles, entered a meditative state. I was the conduit for the experience. We used a small shot glass turned upside down as a planchette. I don't remember the first question or how my reaction was when it first moved. We were sitting on the floor in my room with the board on a rectangular subwoofer acting as a small table. We place only the tip of our finger on the glass, resting. His was at 12 o'clock and mine was at 6. Had one of us moved our fingers to try to influence the glass, it would simply rotate in an awkward way, which we tried after, so that's how I know. We asked many questions to the entity, lifting up the glass and whispering into it. Is there someone that wants to communicate with us? Then placing it down again on our designated start circle. The glass moved to yes. We asked for a name, and so followed a series of questions and answers. Larry died in 1947. He had no connection to the building. I don't recall if we asked him something more. But after that, I said farewell and gave my thanks, as I felt it to be mundane at the time. My friend wanted to continue, so he insisted we ask more questions. I then asked the following questions, starting with number 6, all the way up to 9. When I reached 9, it moved to no instead of the previous yes. So we settled for 8. Is there someone from the 8th dimension that we can communicate with? It moved to yes again. What is your name? It replied with Larry. How old are you? It then proceeds to move to the drawn-up number pad and quickly directs the glass across 6 figures, starting with 4 and 3, then so on, meaning it was over 430,000 years old. Me and my friend then asked the entity a series of ridiculous and fascinating questions, some personal, some scientific, etc. It was all well and good. The communication was impressive to me. The glass moved with a sharp and clear intent for each answer, like someone grabbed the base of the upside-down glass and swiftly moved it to each letter, sometimes spelling words so fast we couldn't keep up and lost some meaning. But I wanted something more. Can you show us a visual sign? It was confirmed with yes. I didn't want anything happening inside my room, so I asked, can you show us outside if we go out on the balcony? The planchette moved to yes. Should we go outside now? It moved across to no. We asked some more unrelated questions, and after about 5 minutes or so, I asked again, is it time for us to go outside now? We got a yes. Me and my friend stood up and went out to the balcony. We had no idea what to expect. It was almost bright outside. The time was 4 o'clock in the morning during mid-August. The street lights were off, but it was still early dawn. From our vantage point of a second-floor apartment, we noticed what we first thought was a rock behind a small shed across the road to the right of the resident parking lot. We then realized that it's a black cat. It sat mesmerized by something behind the shed, out of our view. It then moved to the left, our eyes following, until it was straight ahead of us. Just as it lays down under one of the cars, a white orb of light appears about 6 feet above the ground. It appeared out of nowhere. The orb itself was about the size of a basketball. The light was solid and pure. It was white but did not reflect. It wasn't bright in the sense that it was fuzzy. It was bright like it was a puncture of matter or space-time. It made a quick floating swoosh, swinging rapidly, then disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. When it was gone, I looked at my friend to my left, and he looked at me stunned, with his mouth open. We looked towards the same spot again, and it almost instantly appears again, like a confirmation that we did indeed see what we saw. This time it performed a longer swing and swoosh dance. I don't know how else to describe it, and it came from the right instead. We stayed, amazed, for about 10 minutes, then went back inside. Was the orb of light the sign? I asked the board. The planchette glass slid to the spot on the board that read, yes. It was never really scary. It was just a feeling of wonder. The last time I did it was in 2014. Never seen anything like that orb again, though. Story time. This happened in college in the mid-80s. My best friend and I were playing around with a homemade Ouija. Dina and I made it out of basic notebook paper, with a straw as a planchette. Broke college days, such fun. We got in touch with 2 spirits who claimed to be from World War II, John and Wade. Being the dumb college kids we were, we begged them to send us a sign. They didn't want to, said it would cost a lot of energy and might open a door to other unkind spirits. No, we said, send us a sign. We log off, go to sleep, wake up, go out, run errands. Returning to the dorm room, a message light is blinking on the now antique answering machine. Scroll through. One message in the middle is, Wade, loves Katie. We knew no Wades. No one in Dina's family and my family is named Wade. We had no friends, professors, or fellow students named Wade. And so we proceeded to freak right out. Replayed it, kept freaking out. Oh my, this must be their sign. Then we had the bright idea to bring over our best male buddy and let him hear it. He lived across the way, in the boys' dorms. Dina and I run downstairs. She runs and gets Joe. We run back upstairs. The message light is still blinking. We go to play the messages, and that particular message in the middle is gone. Never came back. Cue more freaking out. Cue a stern warning from Joe about messing with Ouija boards. Dina and I kept doing it, but I noticed my hands going cold all the way up to my elbows. I felt drained, no energy. Then one weekend, my roommate went home. I went out, returned home around dusk. Walked in and the dorm was freezing cold. This was in May, in the deep south. I walked in and saw at the window a giant hand that knocked 3 times. We lived on the 3rd floor. I took one giant step back, said nothing, thought nothing, turned off the light, locked the door, ran down to Dina's dorm room. Cue more freaking out. I told Dina I am spending the night with her even if I have to sleep on the floor. We relaxed. Then I suddenly realized I need my contact solution and clothes. We have to go back. Dina said to give it an hour or 2 more, so we did. Went back in. The room was completely normal. No heaviness, no freezing temperatures, no knocking on windows. Dina and I ripped up the homemade Ouija board, clipped the straw planchette into pieces. Never did it again. I know what I saw. I saw a giant hand knocking on my window through the glass. It shook the window blinds that were pulled up on the inside. And we lived on the 3rd floor. Something wanted in, never again. One Saturday night in 1997, I was visiting my friend Amanda at her cool dad's house with a very fun group of my teenage friends. The 8 of us were playing with a Ouija board in groups of 4, taking turns and watching what we thought was just a silly rite of passage. We were having a blast, lightly drinking, underaged and smoking weed. It was late when the super freaky stuff started to happen. We were all wide awake because the game took weird turns, and I remember seeing 2:22 when I looked over at my friend's VCR where it displayed the time. That's when one of the guys, Ryan the smartass, asked who in the room would be the first to die and how. I was watching and witnessing this. My hand was not on the planchette. I remember that we all were like, dude, why? The planchette moved to the letter U and stopped. We looked around the group to figure out whose name started with a U, but none of ours did. Then I thought out loud, maybe it means you, like Y-O-U? Ryan laughed and said, "Oh really? So how?" The planchette moved to spell out car crash, and that's when my friend Amanda said, "Okay, we are done now," and proceeded to turn on the lights and blow out candles near her. Ryan was the only one still sitting there, staring at the board, sort of half laughing, but also sort of freaked out. I watched him space out for a moment and thought I was maybe too high. But I doubt that, because we all sort of stopped smoking around 2 in the morning, since we were experiencing very strange feelings at the time. Other events happened that night, such as candles not staying lit on a warm, calm summer night, inside a house with the AC off and windows open. We all went outside and laid in the summer grass, and somewhere in that moment, a few of us fell asleep outside or wandered back inside to crash. Smash cut to about 3 months later, Ryan dies in a car wreck near our high school. It happened on a Saturday night, driving back home with his girlfriend after a movie. Thankfully, she survived. He didn't see the semi-truck on a curve, as he pulled out of a side road to turn onto the main road, back into town. It still gives me chills, but we all were freaked out about Ryan, and probably still are to this day. Yes, he was a smartass, but still the spaced out look he had right afterwards made me sure he wasn't moving the planchette around at all. Rest in peace, Ryan. We all miss you. I've dealt with self-elimination ideations for my whole life, and every time I've asked a board how I'm going to die, it says by my own hand. Not so much scary, but definitely creepy. I've never played by myself though, and my friends know about my issues with self-harm, so maybe they're awful people who are messing with me every time. Don't know, but it's become a running joke kind of. But the actual scariest interaction, not the scariest thing said, but the scariest interaction, was when I was playing with it with 2 friends in my friend's room. She was having really scary things happening to her in that room. She and I are sensitive to supernatural things, and she claimed she was being attacked nightly by a malevolent male spirit. We immediately knew we were talking to that spirit once we started playing with the board because it was so ominous and aggressive. Of course, that could have just been a psychological placebo effect, knowing the info she told us. It wouldn't answer any of our questions, it just kept going around like crazy. Then suddenly, I started feeling very bad. I have a history of panic attacks, but I hadn't had any in a while, and I've never had any while playing with a board. Out of nowhere I started feeling one coming on, tingles all over my body, sweating profusely, heart racing. So I said out loud, "We need to leave, I need to go outside." And the board immediately went to no, which was the first time it was coherent. So my friends were like goodbye so that we could close it and go outside, but it just kept going to no over and over again. Finally my friend, the one whose room it was, got it to say goodbye, and we left. I felt immediately better once I was outside. Usually with a panic attack I have to take an anxiety medicine to calm down, but this time it just miraculously dissipated once I left the room. Later that day when I left her house, something pushed me while I was going down the stairs. Thankfully I landed on my butt, and so I just awkwardly slid down the stairs and didn't get hurt. Another somewhat creepy thing a spirit has uttered is when we were talking to a little girl's spirit. It was more sad than creepy, but she told us she couldn't see us. All she could see was darkness around her, that she could only hear us. She didn't remember anything about her life or how she died. She could only remember her dog. It was very sad, and I still think about her. I was playing Ouija with friends one time, and I was definitely the one moving the planchette to scare them. I ended up asking the board to make the chirping crickets around us shut up. We were at a cemetery in the woods at night, and there were literally hundreds of crickets around us chirping, and then I moved the planchette to yes. About a minute later, there was dead silence. The crickets just all stopped chirping simultaneously, and we started running and left the board there. I just didn't understand how that happened because I was the one moving the planchette to scare my friends. And I thought we weren't talking to a spirit, it was all just me. Yes, hundreds of crickets just all simultaneously stopped chirping. No, I've never naturally, or spontaneously experienced a situation like that, where there's a bunch of insects outside in the woods, and suddenly there's just deafening silence. The insects just keep it going all night. Yes, this all did happen. No, I'm not lying. What do I gain about lying about this? Comment karma? I don't even think Reddit existed when this happened. This was about 14 years ago. If it pleases you, I implore that nobody like this comment, because I'm trying to prove how 100% serious and honest I'm being about this. So either a spirit was hanging around and affected the environment, or I have special insect charming abilities that no one has ever known about until that night, which sounds most plausible. This happened a long time ago when I was around 12 or 13. My grandmother passed away when I was 9 from lung cancer. Around 2 years later, my grandfather remarried and moved in with his new wife. The home he lived in where my mother grew up was in an area that was being demolished for the nearby airport development within the next few years. Being that it was so close, he asked my mum if we would like to move in for free until it was torn down. Growing up, I was extremely close with my grandmother and missed her a lot. While going through old things in the basement, I came across an old Ouija board. When asking my mother about it, she remembered her and her sisters using it in the 70s, so this was one of the first editions. At that age, I had the genius idea to use it to connect with my grandmother. At first, I only used it with friends and cousins with nothing much happening, until one day I decided to use it by myself. When speaking to the board, it at first claimed to be my grandmother, but when I pressed for facts, it would get them wrong. It soon told me it was a very old spirit. Then it started to count down, so I got spooked and said goodbye. I took the planchette and put the board back in the basement. Now, during the times I had used it with friends, we did see some weird things, such as shadows out of the corners of our eyes, and one friend had even witnessed a woman standing over me while sleeping in the middle of the night. After that last encounter, things got scary. The shadows were becoming more prominent. All 5 of our pets became spooked in areas that were normally their comfort zones. And I started to constantly get the feeling of being watched by something very dark. At one point, while laying in bed waiting for sleep, one of my cats was laying with me when she abruptly got up and ran out of the room. When I sat up to call her, I saw a dark shadow of a man standing in the doorway to my room. At first I thought it was my dad, but this shadow was above 6 feet tall, whereas my father is barely 5'5", so I quickly knew it was something else. Being the genius preteen I was, I threw the covers over my head and laid there until morning. The second most frightening encounter was when I was on the computer playing games, and another cat who always sat on top of the chair ran off and hid in the den right outside the room. She was a very brave cat, so this was abnormal. I went out and tried to coax her back, but to no avail, and I went back to play my Sims game. Now, when going into that room, the first thing you see is a table with boxes under it, and about a 1 foot gap between the tops of the boxes and the table. When I went back into the room, underneath the table was the most menacing, evil face I had ever seen, staring right back at me. I immediately left that room. Thankfully, shortly after those encounters happened, we moved, and the house was torn down with the Ouija board inside. I never experienced anything after that in our new home, but I will never use a Ouija board again to this day. Not me, but an ex-girlfriend I used to date. She told me the story of when she was in the 6th grade. She and her friends were interested in the occult and witchcraft. They wanted to imitate the characters on the TV show Charmed. One of her friends even claimed to have been born with her third eye open, so she saw things that weren't there. She was their designated medium, and she was regarded as the most experienced among them. They all went to a Catholic girls' school, and during one of the school-wide masses that every student had to be present for, it was some holy day on a Friday at noon, they snuck back to their empty classroom one by one to perform a simpler version of the Ouija board, known as summoning the spirit of the glass or coin, where you draw a makeshift Ouija board out of paper and ink. then use either a coin or drinking glass as your planchette. Some of them thought that to perform the ritual correctly they had to do it on an auspicious day, such as Fridays, Sundays, Mondays, holy days and so on. Then they had to recite the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed backwards, I don't know how. Not long after they started, they summoned someone. They all swear the drinking glass they used started moving on its own, and whatever they summoned answered questions aggressively. The one leading the ritual was their supernaturally attuned friend, who was also asking the questions. At some point, they asked one of the big questions. What will happen in the future? Whatever they summoned answered them. One of you will die. They asked who. It said the name of their medium friend. They asked how. It said, I will kill you. At that instant the glass shattered. Simultaneously, lightning struck a tree branch close to the windows outside their classroom. The lights in the room were flickering on and off, and a strong wind out of nowhere blew the windows and doors of the classroom open in a maelstrom, which they had locked for privacy. Remember, they were supposed to be attending a mandatory mass while this was happening. They all freaked out and ran out of their classroom. All of them, except their medium friend, who looked like she was in a catatonic trance, but they left her behind in the eye of the raging chaos they summoned. When they were found by their teachers and classmates, they all felt nauseous and unwell after their experience. Their parents were called, and they all were suspended for a while. They tried to ask what their friend saw or experienced while she was catatonic. She would get distraught and would just keep saying she either didn't remember or she refused to speak of it. They all recovered with seemingly no ill effects except for their medium friend, who was expelled and was never heard from again. They supposedly stopped dabbling in the occult after that. Needless to say, I was freaked out just listening to her tale at the time. Something in the haunted look she had in her eyes, and the sincerity with which she told her story, convinced me she was telling the truth, or at the very least what she thought really happened. I know this isn't my story, and I don't know if it counts, but I used to date this guy who was a total abusive butthole. He and his friends used a Ouija board. They said they were talking to a demon named Zozo, which is pretty popular, and that Zozo had promised to pay them all a visit in the week, but since there were only 5 of them, 2 of them would get 2 visits. Well, my ex got his visit. He couldn't remember it, but his family was confused as to why he was acting all aggressive, throwing stuff and cursing and just overall being a really heated jerk. He was like that for the whole day, but by the time the next day rolled around, he couldn't remember anything. Friend 1 in his group had a dog, and the whole time they said their dog kept staring at a corner of the room that looked darker than the rest of the room, and that the dog growled and even snapped at the corner. Friend 1 felt like something was watching him the whole night. They were all in high school, and he was so scared that even as a high schooler he hid under his covers to give him just the tiniest amount of relief. The next friend, friend 2, said that their doors kept opening, lights that were on turned off, footsteps stomping around the outside of his room at night, etc. The part that freaked him out the most was that he heard scratching from the other side of the door. He thought maybe because he had a cross in his room he was safe. I think friend 3 got possessed twice in the week because I was told she didn't go to school that week, or the next. My ex was lucky and didn't have 2 visits from Zozo, but just hearing it really freaked me out. As someone who doesn't touch the Ouija board, or even really talk about it, I was very tempted to break up with him over it. Side note, if I ever touched one of those things, my mom would disown me and kick me out. My whole family is highly against this board. After he told me that story, I had a nightmare, and when I woke up, I had sleep paralysis. I was horrified for the whole night. I'd only been dating him for 3-ish months at that point, so I didn't think it was a big deal. The next day I was so tired, paranoid and scared, I told him I wanted to break up and was dead set on it. Somehow he managed to get me to stay, which ended up being a 2-year toxic and abusive relationship. But if I ever again met someone who touched that board, I would most likely cut ties with them right then and there. In case you're wondering what happened in my sleep paralysis episode, I was frozen to my bed. I couldn't even close my eyes. In one corner was a man with horns, but I could only see his silhouette. In another corner was a taller man, completely black, a dark abyss black. In the third corner was this witch-looking figure. Frizzled, messy hair, a long gown, and her face was covered. She was doing this really creepy walk that freaked me out, like she was dislocating her neck and shoulder at once, then putting it back in every step only to take it off and dislocate it the next. Even thinking about it scares me. I've never been so scared in my life. I've never spilled such horrified tears until that night. The board is no joke. No one should be playing it. It is not a game. Remember they tell you to never do it alone? Well, I did, because it was the only way I could be sure no one was moving the coin. I did paper and coin instead of a proper board and planchette. I talked to someone male who died. I asked why it was still around, and it answered car. It gave me a plate number, the name of his wife, and a local phone number. I started thinking this is so mundane, seriously. Then it got kind of forceful. I felt the coin actually pull a little and get warm. Before this I wasn't even sure, it wasn't me moving it. I asked where he was, it spelled infer, and went to the no answer. That detail of using the no to cut corners in the spelling was very interesting. I started saying goodbye and it didn't answer, it simply stopped moving. It didn't answer anything else I asked, so hopefully the spirit left. But I didn't like not having the assurance. I kept the thing for years in a random book, didn't know if burning it or throwing it away was a good idea. Of course I called the number and asked for the wife. I was told she wasn't there. I asked, but does she live there? Of course we are notoriously paranoid as a country about giving info to strangers on the phone, so I got the typical treatment. Who is this? Why are you calling? I hung up, so I don't know if any of it checked out. Never did it again. Never had anything weird happen after. So, my sister passed away last year in April, and when she was around 18 years old she moved into a super haunted house with some of her friends. I was 8 at the time and I would go to her house often. Well, I would go over there and stay the night, and I could never fully sleep. I always cried, which wasn't super strange for an 8-year-old. But it only happened at that house. Well, she told me a few years later, because it would have scared me if she still lived there. Here is her story. My sister and her 3 other roommates decided to use a Ouija board, and they summoned this spirit named Adrian. She asked him how he died, and he said Mum, and when they asked him why, he said God. So weird. There are many things that could mean. But he ended up being pretty cool, she said. They kept talking to him that night. One of her friends asked, "Hey Adrian, can I light a cigarette?" And he said yes. They all laughed, and then each friend went in a circle asking to light a cigarette. And then my sister's friend said, "Can she light a cigarette?" She was referring to my sister when she asked that. Adrian answered with no. I remember asking her, why did he say no? She just said she didn't know. After she died, I was talking to my cousin about my sister, and he told me that a week before she died, she admitted that a spirit was still following her. I still don't get the connection entirely, but it scares me that she was still talking about a spirit haunting her years after. My mother used a Ouija board as a kid, with her friends. The board spelled out dark, and then the power shut off suddenly, and a loud banging was heard in the next room over. They immediately ceased using it. The house was owned by a religious nut. Everything she did was for God, but ironically her reputation labelled her an evil woman. Jump to 20 or more years down the road, my mom births my little sister. At the age of 10, my sister explained in great detail exactly what the house looked like, as soon as you walk through the front doors, right up to the last room upstairs. She also described a man standing there behind a desk in overalls. That man she described was my mother's grandfather, spent his life behind a desk at that house, running a mail service, and usually wore nothing but blue coveralls. She even described the day bed that was in the living room my great-grandmother used all the time. When she was 10, she didn't know what a day bed was. nor would she think one would be placed in the living room. When we asked her how she was able to describe all this, given the fact that we were hundreds of miles away from that house, and she never stepped foot inside, she told us she dreamt of it. She also, for 2 years straight, every night, woke us up crying in full panic mode, because there used to be an old lady that stood in the corner of her room screaming at her. She's now 18 and still swears this happened. We've come to terms with the fact that the lady was my mother's grandmother, as the description fits the bill. That plot of land was always very, very unsettling, and no one ever cared to be left alone there. We lived in one of the houses on that plot for years, and we used to request a buddy system to go into the basement, because we could feel something watching us. The generation before me complained about that basement too. On that same plot of land, there were off-road paths leading into the woods. I was an avid four-wheeler, and used to love going into the woods to dick around. I went up that path one day to sneak away for a cigarette, and the entire time I was up there, I felt so unsettled I swore to never go alone again. My family lived on that plot since the dawn of time, so there's been multiple stories and sightings that have gone around. Made my grandfather and mother in their earlier years believe in the paranormal, straight from skeptics to die-hard believers. I have no intentions of ever going back to that place. I went way off track over a simple Ouija question, but I figured it was much more interesting than just saying the first sentence. When I was 13, my friend's father ran a historic site where there were daily tours. My friend Lisa and I dressed in old-time costumes and helped out. It was supposedly the most haunted building in the city, and weird things did happen often. One afternoon after closing, Lisa's father left us alone while he ran some errands. We went up to the bedroom where we would change to our regular street clothes. We found an old Ouija board and decided to see if there really were ghosts. We sat on the floor, Lisa's back facing the wall and me across from her. We asked the board if anyone was there. No movement. We asked a few other questions, but we got no response. Just when we were ready to give up, I shouted in frustration, "If someone is there, show us and stop being a scaredy cat." Suddenly, a huge mirror that was on the wall behind Lisa fell off the wall and crashed over her head. We sat in utter shock, mouths hanging open, wooden frames surrounding Lisa, bits of glass and brown paper scattered everywhere. Then we jumped up, pulled the frame off Lisa and ran downstairs, opened the door, and waited on the front step until her dad got back. Luckily she only had a big lump on her head, but we got yelled at, and of course he didn't believe us. Apparently that mirror had been hanging there for almost 100 years, so why would it suddenly fall? Needless to say, that was the end of my volunteering that summer. Later, Lisa told me that she came up with an idea to get her father off her back, because he was so irate about the broken mirror. Since he refused to believe us anyway, she told him that we had only said the mirror fell after our Ouija board session, so he wouldn't blame her for the damage done. She told him we were just hanging out when the mirror fell off the wall unexpectedly, and she knew he would be upset because the mirror was so important to his exhibit. Maybe blaming a ghost would keep him from becoming too disappointed. Her father then forgave her and stopped blaming her for the accident, chalking it up to a coincidental mishap due to the mirror being old, heavy, and perhaps having worn out the 100-year-old nails keeping it held up. Of course, this was a load of bull. She and I knew what had really happened, but it wasn't worth being grounded for weeks when her dad didn't even believe her story in the first place. To this day, that was one of the spookiest things that I've ever witnessed. When I was in high school, my friend Kate and I spent the night at another friend's house. That night, we did the Ouija board, and it was moving around giving us answers to our questions. I don't remember what was talked about, and I assumed it was my friend Jackie moving it, because that's something she'd probably do. Well, after we went to bed, we kept waking up and hearing things like footsteps in the room, things clinking on the mirror, etc. I assumed we were just freaked out from the Ouija board, so I just went back to sleep. In the morning, Jackie's dad told us that at around 2 or 3 in the morning, he came upstairs to ask us why we were running around so much and making so much noise. Her parents' room was right below her room, but when he came in the room, all of us were fast asleep with the lights off. He said the noise was going on all night. We were utterly shocked and had goosebumps after we heard this. None of us were woken by any noises in the room during the night. We didn't even hear her father come into the room to check on us. The fact that he heard so much noise he felt compelled to come upstairs was pretty freaky. Afterward, we went up to her room, where Jackie promptly disposed of her Ouija board, and we didn't try to talk her out of it. My sister hates it, but she sees dead people. She's used to it, and very few people in our family know this. Back when we were teenagers, her boyfriend brought over a board, and a bunch of us were playing. When my sister and I played together, the planchette started going crazy. When we asked who was there, it started spelling a name real fast. Too fast for us to really make it out. We asked for it to slow down, and it did a bit, but it was still going really fast, so we barely made out the spelling, L-U-C. I asked Lucy, after a very emphatic no. It continued spelling from the beginning, L-U-C-I-F. At this point we freaked out and started to ask it to leave, to no avail, until my sister's boyfriend stood behind her, and the planchette started to slowly crawl on the board. We couldn't figure out why until it started asking for him to leave. A friend in the room realized he was wearing a crucifix, and we were able to use it to get it to leave. I had a second scary experience years later, but this one gives me goosebumps. Even 30-some years later, I think it is significant that an entity that was identifying itself as Lucifer would be uncomfortable with a crucifix in the room. Whenever people tell me they don't believe in God, I think back to this incident. Whatever that spirit was, definitely believes God is real, and fears the power of the cross for some reason. If an entity we can't see or hear is acknowledging the realness of God, I don't want to take the chance of not being a believer. So I hope, if you are someone reading these stories and follow a religion that worships one Lord, your faith should be strengthened when you hear these accounts. Humans can't see what's on the other side. We may have our doubts, but I think better safe than sorry is a good thought process to have when it comes to the notion that a creator is out there somewhere watching us and waiting for us to return to it when we move on to the next realm. The Ouija board helped me to solidify my beliefs. I did the Ouija board for the first time ever when I was 13 years old. I did it with my cousin. We sat in my dark bedroom and started asking random questions. Nothing happened and we gave up, watched TV, and eventually went to bed. That night I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time ever. It terrified me. I had no idea what was happening. I felt awake. I literally looked around my room and saw my cousin sleeping next to me and all. But I could not move other than my eyeballs. I was frozen in place. I couldn't speak either. All I could do was look around my dark room, straining to breathe heavily and hear the things around me. That's when the noises started. I started hearing laughter in my room, like a mocking type of laugh. My heart was going out of control at this point. That's when a voice started calling my name in a teasing way. Then the voices were replaced by this train-like noise getting louder and louder. Then suddenly all the noises and sounds just came to a stop. My eyes searched the room, and to my absolute horror, there was someone standing at my doorway. A dark and tall silhouette. It was just watching me. I was internally screaming. My eyes closed, and I started breathing as loud as I could. Eventually, my cousin woke up next to me and shook me, causing me to snap out of the paralysis. I screamed out for my dad, "I know, what a baby," and he rushed into the room. I insisted someone was in the house, the dark silhouette I saw. I freaked the poor guy out. He ran all over the house, checking closets and rooms and the garage, but there was nobody there who shouldn't be. I was shaking, telling them about what happened. My parents just looked at each other, obviously creeped out, and told me to say a prayer and go to bed with nice thoughts. Well, little did I know that I had just experienced the first of many sleep paralysis incidents. I'm 33 now and still experience some of these incidents. They are freaky as hell, but over the years I've learned how to deal with it. But the question is, did the Ouija board have something to do with this? Did it open up some kind of channel? Or was it just a weird coincidence? We were in a cabin in the woods. Several 100 yards away was an old cemetery, almost out of sight. Had it not been for the little outdoor excursion I had taken the morning before, I wouldn't have known it was there. The only two people who knew it was there were my cousin and myself. Late in the evening, we pulled out an old Ouija board from a closet. We messed around for a while, then one of our friends decided to ask for its name. It started with an A. Then they asked how it died. I can't remember that part, but then they asked what year it died and where it was buried. It said something along the lines of, in the year 1800 something. I died in a fire, and my body is located in the cemetery down the road. My cousin and I froze, and we gave each other a long stare. We told our friends about the cemetery, and we went to explore it. Sure enough, there was a grave with his info on it. Unbelievable. I was a teenager living in rural South Australia, and my mum was into the paranormal, so we tried a Ouija board twice with a friend of hers. The first time my grandpa, who had passed away about 6 years earlier, allegedly came through and told her words to the effect that he forgave her for how angry she used to get when he would make silly mistakes while he was driving with her in the car. And the second time someone came through and told us that there were babies buried in our front yard, under where Mum was growing roses, random and terrifying. Now the actual babies part we never confirmed, but Mum went to the council and found out the old house we lived in was the district hospital during the early parts of the 20th century, up until the end of WW1. And that included recorded births occurring there, so it did present the possibility of stillborn babies having to be buried outside. Never had any ghostly or other freaky experiences there, though. And for the record, I don't believe in Ouija boards connecting us to spirits. The first experience was probably a subconscious cathartic experience for Mum and involved micro-movements. But the second one, I have no idea. It was my first time playing Ouija. My mom had played it before. We asked my grandpa some questions, got mostly yes answers. When we started to ask my grandma questions, it went silent. The dream I had that night picked up with us playing, asking grandma questions but getting no response. The candle we lit went out. There was a cold rush of air in the room. I felt an insane tickling up my spine, like every vertebrae was a string on a harp. My neck was grabbed. I lost control of my body as I reached for a knife in the kitchen and went after my mum. I was crying as my body went full. Here's Johnny going after my mum. She couldn't escape the house. I was so shaken when I woke up. For a moment I thought I had actually harmed my mother. I don't know what came over me. I had never had such strong feelings of animosity toward my mother, who I got along with generally well. I vowed to never play Ouija again, and I haven't since. I haven't had many scary experiences, but definitely the most insane one was my second time ever using it. It was my last day of the semester before I moved out of my very old prison-like dorm. My roommate, who was also a high school friend of mine, was hanging out with a female friend of mine that was wanting to explore his Ouija board. This is the first and only time I've used a board with a mix of genders, and I've heard that adds power to the board. Has anyone else heard this? We talked to a few spirits, but they were quite weak and bland with the responses. Then comes the spirit who identified itself as Neo. Neo claimed to be a crip and died in a gang fight and was in Boston looking for his aunt. It took a liking to my roommate since it reminded him of a friend when he was alive. Neo would say my roommate's nickname every once in a while between questions. This spirit seemed to have a significantly greater amount of power compared to others, and the planchette moved a lot quicker and stronger than all the ones before. It also lasted a lot longer than any other sessions. Now to the freaky part. A little context. My first name is Hayden. After asking enough questions to get a good idea of Neo's story and stuff, I decided to ask where they were in the room. It responded with my roommate's name and then my female friend's name. I then said, "So right here?" and stuck my hand in between them and wiggled it around a bit, and the planchette flew out of our hands to no. It then started to spell out Hay, and I started to get a bit nervous since I hadn't mentioned my name and neither did my friends. It finished with the word sack. It started spelling haysack over and over again, and when I asked if it was referring to me, it immediately went to yes. It then proceeded to do all the classic red flags with the board, and we would scold it to stop, and it would stop only to call me haysack again. Then resume counting 0 to 9 or Z to A or to the corners of the board. This was significant because even though my other two friends had introduced themselves to Neo, the entity referred to both of them by a nickname that it assigned to each. By now we basically yelled at it like a dog, and eventually forced a goodbye on it. Neo then continued to pop up in almost every other session we had during that day. The moment it identified itself as Neo, we forced a goodbye, until the last time. We asked if it would cooperate and not try any funny business. It agreed to, and after a bit of conversing, it promised it would keep my roommate company until they moved out. I left a week early due to transferring out of that college. That was probably the scariest moment I had with a board, but I had another freaky one that was more just kind of solid proof, as opposed to something scary. A group of friends and I went urban exploring at a massive abandoned mental hospital that has a bit of a rocky history. One of those friends was my old roommate mentioned before, so they brought their board with them. After a bit of wandering, we found a narrow wooden staircase that led to a subterranean level of the building, and discovered some meat lockers. Our bright minds decided to use the board in one of the lockers, with the big metal door almost closed. After a few attempts at getting some contact, things just felt really weak and disconnected. So a few of my friends who were spectators and also filming decided to leave and explore elsewhere. When my friend with the camera went up the staircase, the microphone got a bunch of disturbance and stopped the moment he left the staircase. This roughly lined up to me and two other friends who stayed back with the board, attempting our last contact before packing up and receiving a very weak signal from the spirit realm. The planchette moved at the speed of molasses, and to test the board, we asked how many people were above us since we knew how many went up, and we heard them up there too. The people using the board heard the footsteps and a dragging noise that we identified afterwards as a fire hose. The board went right over the correct number and landed on 0. Assuming the board was incorrect, we gave up and packed everything up. When we got up the stairs, we found the room empty of people and our friends in a completely separate building. Because we heard noises above us for a bit, we asked them when they had left, and they said they were messing around with the hose when one of them wandered out of the building and toward another one. Then the others swiftly dropped the hose and followed. That meant the board was technically correct, and there was no way any of the people using the board could have known this, so it couldn't have been faked. That was one of the sessions I really solidified my belief that the Ouija board is a conduit for supernatural activity. For the record, I'm a skeptic, but I do want to believe. This is pretty much the only cool story I ever have to tell. When my brother was 9 and I was 6, he told my parents and I at dinner one night that he learned a new word, and it was the mother of all words. The word was the F word, and to no one's surprise, major punishment ensued. Since he could no longer use the word at home, he just would say, "Oh, mother of all words," instead of the actual word, thinking it was hilarious. My brother had to babysit me for no pay for 1 hour, while my parents were at the next door neighbour's BBQ as some of his punishment. We had never played with the Ouija board before, but he really wanted to that night since my parents weren't there, and he thought, well, there's no better time to ask the spirits all of his inappropriate 9-year-old boy questions. He kept moving the planchette to spell out boobs, or had it spell that I was ugly, and at that point I wasn't having fun, and said I was going to get my parents and tell them he's calling me ugly. He tells me not to go, that he's going to ask a question for real this time, and it's not going to be mean towards me. It's just going to make me laugh. He promises. He was cracking up as he asked, "Spirits, what is the mother of all words?" It spelled God. I realize as an adult that there is nothing scary about that, but when you're 9 and 6, you run and hide under the bed until your parents are home. We never messed with it again after that. I was convinced my brother didn't influence the planchette's movements, because at that stage he wouldn't have hesitated to spell out mother of all words, just to have a laugh. God is not the clever response my brother would have come up with at that moment, and his sincere reaction of shock and terror was not being faked, so who were we talking to? When I was 13, me and my two friends, Amy and Leah, used a board. Amy's mum had passed away recently, so we asked to speak to her, and someone or something came through and said that it was her mum. We started asking questions and were getting really slow, weak answers, but suddenly the planchette started moving much more forcefully and spelling out F-U over and over. Amy took her hand off of the planchette and got very upset, thinking that one of us was messing with her. It wasn't me, and Leah swore it wasn't her either. Just then we saw the perfect shadow, or silhouette, of what looked like a man walking by. We were sitting on the floor, in a hallway with no windows. There was absolutely no explanation for the shadow figure we all saw walk by. We all started screaming and teenage girl theatrics ensued. I still get chills when I think about that. Needless to say, that was the last time I ever messed around with one of those things. It was an unforgettable moment. Not me, but my mum and dad. My brother is 7 years older than me, and the story goes like this. My parents rented a house that my mum's aunt and uncle owned in the late 70s. The aunt committed self-termination in the early 60s in the back bedroom of the upper floor. Shortly after my brother was born, they decided to use a Ouija board to try and contact her aunt. After a few questions and inquiries, they asked a question that prompted the board to respond with Move J. My brother's name is Jason, but he goes by Jay. They moved his crib to their room. A short few days later, a massive storm caused a tree branch to crash through my brother's bedroom window. It landed where his crib would have been. I didn't have a hand in the Ouija board, but my older sister and her friend did. In fact, we didn't have an actual board, so they came up with the idea to make one. They were upstairs in my sister's room while I was downstairs in mine. I was just minding my own business. No idea that they were up to something like that. All of a sudden, without even hearing them running or coming down the stairs, I get crazy loud banging on my door, and my sister and her friend yelling out my name. I usually always lock my door so they weren't able to get inside. When I opened it, they both looked completely shocked and confused. I asked what the heck was going on, and my sister told me that they both heard me screaming, as if I was being attacked or hurt and that I was calling out for her. I was so very confused because I hadn't made a peep all night. After I reassured them that I hadn't made any noise or called out for her at all, they told me what they were doing upstairs, and that they made a Ouija board. When they started using it, almost immediately, they heard me screaming like a horror movie victim. About 15 years later, I asked my sister about that night, and she swears that she and her friend had heard me screaming out for her, and that it was not a prank of any sort. Now that I'm writing this, it has never occurred to me to ask what it was they asked the board. The whole thing was so creepy, my sister just wanted to forget about it. And we didn't really discuss it except when I asked her if she was pranking me back then. I will update this post if she ever fills me in on her memories of what they asked the board, because I'm certain others are curious to know, just as I am. I went through a phase in high school where I would try to play the board with friends over and over again. It would never work, and as a skeptic of the paranormal, I honestly thought it was a clever marketing ploy. Then one night, my buddies and I took the spirit board out in my friend's backyard, out in a rural area near a cornfield. I was feeling froggy as I was drinking a lot, and remember, asking a bunch of stupid questions. It still wasn't working, but there was a weird temperature change where we were standing, with a twirling wind around us. Noticeable enough that my buddies mentioned it out loud, like, what the heck is going on? So I capitalized on the creepiness of the moment, and asked the board the most obnoxious question I could think of. When is Landon going to die? Landon was one of the friends present during our session. My buddy and I, who were touching the planchette, watched it spell out the word soon. I thought my buddy was moving it, so I started acting like it actually worked, in order to scare the other guys. I dramatically pretended to be creeped out in my mind, playing along with the prank that I assumed my buddy was pulling on the rest of the gang. I imagined us having a great laugh about it later, embarrassing the crew for getting scared like a bunch of squeamish girls. That is, until my buddy finally admitted that he honestly didn't move it. I then freaked out and watched my friend look stunned, as I kept grilling him not to play around with me because I thought we were in on the same joke. Once we all realized there were no jokes being pulled, we picked up our stuff and headed out of the cornfield. We all kind of forgot about it, or didn't bother talking about it with each other, though we still hung out regularly. About a year or so later, my friend Landon was given a motorcycle for Christmas. He wanted to proudly show it off, and decided to take it for a spin to celebrate his holiday luck. Even though it was snowy and slippery outside, he got overzealous and sped up a residential street to impress the neighbours who came out to watch and be festive. Apparently, the motorcycle skidded on some black ice and caught him off guard. He crashed the bike into a tree on the curb and flew off. He wasn't even wearing a helmet because he was in a rush to test out the bike. He landed and bounced a few times on his head, and to everyone's shock, he was unconscious in a matter of seconds. The people who witnessed this included one of my friends that had been with us during the cornfield spirit board session. He happened to live on the same street as Landon. Landon didn't survive the crash. He died Christmas Day in the hospital. My friends and I, who were playing that day, talked about the event at his funeral. We were inconsolable. I learned my lesson, unfortunately, the hard way, not to take these things as a joke. As brutal as it is to bring up these traumatizing memories, I thought it would be wise to share this story in case some other young people reading this might be thinking about playing around with a spirit board. Be careful what you allow into your life. Just because you can't see or hear them doesn't mean there aren't entities interacting with us from their realms, and not all of those entities are harmless. Man, I feel so heartbroken for his family. I feel so guilty about asking that stupid board when Landon would die. Why did I do that? About 10 years ago, a friend and I were playing with a Ouija board at my house. We had the lights off, candles lit, the whole thing. Nothing much happens at first, then it starts spelling out something. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. Neither of us could quite make it out, as it appeared to be in another language. I got a pencil and wrote the letters out. It looked Italian to me, so we decided to look the word up in an Italian dictionary. The word was choke. It was then that we noticed the air around us feeling very thick and still. We kept trying to ask it questions, and the cursor only repeatedly pointed to the word no. We asked it things like, are you alive? Are you a human? Are you happy? Do you need help? Then suddenly the candles blew out and something hit the window with a loud thud. We jumped in shock, not knowing what to do next. We just stared at each other, speechless. My friend mustered up the courage to glance out the window to see what could have made the noise. On the ground just outside was a black bird twitching around. I'm guessing it flew into the window and crashed on the ground. Completely freaked us out. At the sight of the bird, my friend started wheezing and looking like he was having a hard time catching his breath. He pointed to his book bag, and when I handed it to him, he frantically fished around inside and pulled out his inhaler and started puffing away. I proceeded to turn on all the lights and put the Ouija board away. His breathing became stabilized a few moments later, and we talked about the shock of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I guess you can say it was all a coincidence. Maybe the candles blew out because one of us accidentally got too close and breathed heavily over them. I mean, it's a stretch but plausible. Maybe the bird just had weird timing when it crashed into the window while we were engaged in this questionably supernatural ritual. Maybe my friend's asthma attack was brought on by his fear and panic at that moment. Nonetheless, it hasn't stopped me from using a spirit board in the future. but it was a good 5 years or so before I played with it again. I haven't had any significantly scary incidents since then, but that one was unforgettable. My mother is scared of the Ouija board, like literally. The experience she had from a teenager made it so that she has a phobia of them and is scared of one being in the house. She played the Ouija board as a teen with her friends one night, using a glass as a planchette. Apparently the glass flew up in the air and smashed, and the dog their friends had was so scared that they wouldn't come out from hiding under the furniture in the house. It was too terrified. After that happened, she said the dog would randomly bark and growl at a certain spot in the corner of the room where she and her friends performed their game. Every time she would go to her friend's house, she would notice the dog looking suspiciously into that corner, and they would have to physically pull the dog away and put it in a different room so it would calm down. She said it gave her the major creeps. So this is how she developed the fear of Ouija boards. I also had an ex who used one once while I was dating her. They didn't do it around me, but while they were at a party. We suspected that perhaps a spirit might have followed her home after, because I witnessed the bedroom door of her mother's opening and closing by itself. Her mother wouldn't sleep in that room because of it. She often slept on the couch or in a spare room. I had the fright of my life when I suddenly had a spirit appear right in front of my face, with their back turned to me, blood-soaked hair, and slowly turning to face me, so close they could have kissed me. I flew back and threw myself backwards in shock. This was in my ex-girlfriend's home. Scared the crap out of me. So, after that I totally understood why my mum felt so fearful of those boards and didn't want to have anything to do with them. When I was about 12, I went to this girl's house with a few friends. We cleverly decided to play with the Ouija board. There were maybe 5 of us, I can't remember for sure, but I recall there being a handful of us crowding her space. So here we were, a batch of pre-teens, sitting in her living room, all hands on the board, all taking it very seriously. We asked if there was a spirit. The pointer moved to yes. I don't remember what few questions we asked afterward, but we started getting a little creeped out, because everyone had a finger on the pointer, and the way our hands were positioned, it was becoming clear that if one person was moving, or trying to control it, the pointer would be exhibiting really awkward and jerky movements. However, it moved very smoothly and deliberately around the board. So we asked the board if we could stop playing and leave. The pointer moved over to no, and it kept saying no when we would repeatedly ask if we could leave, or even when we would request for it. Whatever spirit was possessing the pointer would leave. It felt like it was getting more and more aggressive to keep our attention. Being a bunch of terrified kids with rapidly declining patience, we just decided, screw this, and shut the board. We carelessly tossed it in its box and ran out of the house. We were playing in the front living room, so it was an easy dash right out the front door. When we all got outside and caught our breath, my friend, who I had been sitting right next to the whole time, complained that his back hurt, like he scratched it or something. He lifted up the back of his shirt so we could see if there was a bug bite or something, and I kid you not, there were 5 red marks going down his back that looked like fingernail marks. We completely lost it, and I have the chills even thinking about it now. I 100% believe that the spirit got pissed at us and did not appreciate us trying to end the session abruptly. Therefore it lashed out at my friend. Needless to say, I haven't played with a Ouija board since and have absolutely no intention of doing it ever again. As I'm retelling this, I'm realizing that my friend who was scratched was the only guy in the group, so I'm wondering if the spirit lashed out at him specifically and not us females because of some weird spirit chivalry. Man, I don't even know. But I do know this. That was some scary stuff. I'm actually here because I wondered if anyone had a similar experience. When I was 16, about 10 years ago, my aunt, who I was very close with, my mum and grandma all started practicing Wicca, and so did I. So we already had altars and candles and tarot and did all kinds of stuff. Well, my aunt brought over this Ouija board one day. It's got a Hasbro logo, so I don't think too much of it, but I'm excited to see what happens. We start out asking if anyone is with us. We get Richard, who says he's 4. Bad spelling here and there, but pretty good for a 4-year-old. Also, my aunt has a boyfriend named Richard, so I'm suspicious. I get bored and we stop. A week or so later, we take it to my grandpa's RV, and it appears as though we've contacted my grandma, who had recently passed away. Not my grandma the Wiccan, but on the other side of my family. She said things like, "I love you, take care of Grandpa," and all that. We cried and kept trying to talk to her, but she eventually stopped answering. At some point, a boy answers, says his name is Arbor. I ask his age, he's my age. I ask his eye colour, he says, "Pretty hazel like yours." I'm a teenage girl, so I think I'm in love with a ghost. He says he has to go take care of his sister now, so we say goodbye, and from then on, I'm obsessed with talking to Arbor, but I never hear from him again. I try with my aunt, I try by myself, I try with a few friends, nothing. One friend contacted what seemed to be his deceased father, but there wasn't much to it. So I'm having too much fun with this thing, and eventually my aunt and I are using it like normal. We ask if anyone wants to speak with us, and we get Seth. We ask who they are. How did they die? It says, "The one who makes you do bad things." And the planchette was pulled away from us off the board. We freak out and stop for a second and then try asking another question. But the planchette is pulled off the board again. We never played again. She left it at my house, and when my dad, who was a Christian, saw it, he freaked out and made me throw it away. I've had a few weird things happen, but nothing that makes me think it's connected. But I've always wondered who Seth was. All I can think of is the Egyptian god, Seth. I doubt I was talking to an Egyptian god, or if those even really exist. Also, I always wondered if anyone else had ever heard of people having to take care of others in the afterlife. What does that even mean? Please let me know if you ever had a similar experience, or can make any sense of what happened to me. In the mid-80s, my mum was a cleaner in Australia. She would clean houses in suburban areas, and would sometimes do houses in rural or wine regions. We lived near both. She would leave business cards at the local shops, and got most of her business this way, and some through referrals and word of mouth. One day, she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was around 60, asking Mum to clean her old farmhouse. She made a lot of odd demands, and Mum would usually meet clients before taking on new business. In this case, the lady did not want to meet Mum, and said she would leave the keys under the front doormat. Mum agreed mainly because the lady was quite obviously wealthy, and was offering to pay Mum substantially more than she would reasonably expect. Mum went to the house on a Monday morning, and said she already felt unnerved by the long driveway. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large and very empty property. She found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the clean, she hears the back door shut. Mum was told no one would be at the house, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 or 4 minutes, although she said it could have been much longer. There was no other car on the property. She wanted to leave immediately, but had 2 rooms left to do. Both were bedrooms. She said as time passed and she heard nothing else, she decided that perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps something had fallen and it wasn't the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom. All over the bed were black and white photos. As Mum got closer, she realized the photos were all of her. Some were taken at our family home, and many others were taken at other houses Mum would clean. Some through windows or over fences. She used the house phone to call the police and immediately drive to the end of the driveway. The old lady ended up being investigated, but continued to claim that it was a break-in. After some time, the police stopped their search, and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time Mum tells me this story, I get serious chills. Absolutely a true story too. To this day, my mum is convinced the old lady had something to do with it, but why, and for what purpose? Any theories? This happened in the fall of 1993, when I was 20 years old. In the interest of context, This was before I started college, and I was working in the material prep department of a plastics factory on the night shift. I was the only woman in the department, and my male co-workers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job, but I proved myself and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it also put me in the best shape of my life. It was also about this same time that I dumped my abusive boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything, is probably why I got myself into this situation in the first place. I had just gotten off work, and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was running on fumes, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age approached me, looking nervous and scared. She said that she had been at her boyfriend's house, and they'd had a fight. She'd walked to the gas station to use the payphone so she could call a friend to pick her up. On her way to the station, a car pulled up as she was walking, and the guys inside started catcalling and harassing her. With a slight movement of her head, she indicated a car that was parked off to the side by the gas station dumpsters. I saw a large, light green car, like a Caddy or a Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they threatened her, and she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was neat, well-dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that. She just seemed really nervous and freaked out, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished pumping my gas and told her to hop in the car, that I'd take her home. At that time on a weeknight, there was little traffic, so I booked it right out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. She kept twisting around in the seat to see if the car was behind us, and when I asked her to put her seatbelt on, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks down the road, however, I noticed she was looking around the car, and she started asking me about money. "Where's your purse? Where's your bag? I need money. You need to give me some money." My stomach sank. I have this woman in my car, and now she's going to rob me. But when I thought about it, robbery just didn't make much sense. I was driving a 1985 Chevy, affectionately nicknamed Crapbox, and was wearing my work clothes, a ratty t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. I did not look like a person with a lot of cash, primarily because I wasn't a person with a lot of cash. She twisted around in the seat again and started yelling, "There they are! There they are!" She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked the rear view, and sure enough, the light green car is right behind me. She started cackling and bouncing up and down in the seat. "My boys are going to F you up, B. They're going to F you up." She's laughing like crazy, opening the glove box, looking in the back for a bag or purse, telling me all the messed up stuff these guys are planning to do to me. Now, if I had been smart, I would have just driven to the police station. Actually, if I had been very smart, I would have called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they arrived. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until later. At the moment, I just got really, really angry. I realized 3 key things all at once. There was an intersection up ahead, with cars on either side waiting to cross, and the light had just turned yellow. I had a spare box cutter that I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment. The crazy chick still hadn't put on her seatbelt. I did not think. I floored it and passed under the yellow light just as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had started to move, and they hadn't caught up. The woman started yelling. I slammed on the brakes, and she hit the dash and windshield with a solid and viciously satisfying crack. When she rebounded to the passenger seat, I had the box cutter in her face and was screaming some seriously crazy words. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of, "Get the hell out. Get the hell out of my car before I cut off your face and make you eat it, B." The crazy screaming and box cutter combo worked. She grabbed blindly at the handle and popped the door open, and I started shoving and punching her until the heifer tumbled out the door to the curb. I stomped on the gas, got to the next turn, and squealed around it with the passenger door still open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid that the green car might catch up to me. After a little while, I stopped to close the passenger door, and then I cut across town and got onto the highway to go home. I was on the highway for about 5 minutes before the shake started. I pulled off to the shoulder to calm down and get myself together, and then I drove home. I told my older sister everything that happened. I was living with her temporarily after the breakup with my ex. She wrapped me in a tight bear hug while simultaneously yelling about how stupid I was for not going to the police. I've never been so glad to be yelled at in my life. I have always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night, and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until one night, when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light, after dropping him off at home at 2 a.m. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off until well after 1 in the morning. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light was one of those that seemed broken until it finally turned green right when you finally decided to just run it. Of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light seeing as no one was there and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week, I had heard the phrase, integrity is what you do when no one is looking. And for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of integrity. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would be just an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me so I could just get out of there. I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her and she motioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button and that thing just coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she did not seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said, "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny and of indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was a 60-something-year-old who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend, but there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, and like she was disconnected from the moment, that made my skin crawl. And after a brief debate on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and could not give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said the same thing again. "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" This time I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride and told her I had a curfew and had to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again. "My boyfriend beat me." At this point the light changed. I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, then looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. "You made the right decision." Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do. or if there were people waiting to jump in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in. But that encounter has haunted me ever since and has confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. Okay, I have to comment here because this actually happened to me at a gas station when I was on my way home from a football game in high school. I had read about similar experiences online, so when this actually happened, I don't even know how my brain went where it did, but it ended up being brilliant and I would highly recommend this to anyone. The gas station I was at had other people there, so at the time this girl approached me, I wasn't really scared. She gave me that same BS line about her boyfriend beating her and asking if she could have a ride to her friend's house down the road. Do these criminals get ideas from the same manuals or something? Instead of being scared, I remembered accounts I had heard of where people had given those in need of help a ride, and it hadn't ended well. I found myself really, really angry and thought, you want to play? Oh, I'll play. To clarify, she wasn't beaten. She looked like an average girl. But her eyes were jumping all over the place, and she was giving me a strange smile. When she asked me for a ride, I offered her my most sinister smile, licked my lips, and I leaned forward and whispered, I can give you a ride, but only if you promise to ride in my trunk, like a good girl. I gave her the crazy eyes and licked my lips again, and she got scared silly, muttered no thanks, and took off like a bat out of hell. So in other words, sometimes battling evil by appearing evil yourself can work. FYI, I'm a girl, so I'm sure the fact that I demanded another girl to ride in my trunk threw her for a loop. Stay safe, y'all. So this is a story that happened to my mom's friend in Korea about like 10 years ago. Every time I hear this story, I still get the chills. My mom's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul. She was a stay-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the days. One day, she was coming home from running errands with her daughter and got onto the elevator in her building. When she got on, she noticed that there was a man wearing a cap and a yellow raincoat, and he kept his head low so that she couldn't really see his face. She immediately felt really uneasy, and she made her daughter stand to her side, furthest away from the man. What made her feel even more uncomfortable was that when she pressed the button for her floor, there was no other lit number, and on top of that, she noticed that he was carrying something wrapped inside a newspaper close to his side. Things started to click in my mum's friend's head, and she started to panic, and decided to take out her cell phone and pretend she was calling home to her husband, who was obviously really not at home and at work. She started saying things like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you get the door for me?" And making it seem like her husband was waiting at home. When the elevator did reach her floor, I think she lived on the 12th floor or something, she quickly got off and grabbed her daughter and started to walk as fast as she could to her apartment. She noticed that the man also got off on her floor and was slowly following her down the hallway. When my mum's friend got to her door, she started to bang on it and shout, "Hey, yobbo," which is a word spouses use to show endearment. "I'm home, please open the door," and kind of pretended like he was coming to answer the door. Upon seeing this, the man in the yellow raincoat started to walk away back towards the elevator. When he seemed to be far away enough, my mum's friend quickly picked up her daughter and slid open her door's passcode thing. This is usually how people get into their homes in Korea, and started to frantically punch in her key code. But the problem was that the buttons would make sounds, so the man knew that no one was going to answer the door for her, and he turned around and started to run back towards her. My mum's friend, at this point, was practically screaming, and when she finally got her door to open, the first thing she did was throw her daughter in through the door. When she got in herself, she saw that the man was pretty much inches from the door, but she managed to shut it and lock it before he could wedge his hand or weapon into the door. Afterwards, looking through the door's peephole, she saw that the man was walking away back towards the elevator. Several months later, my mum's friend was watching the news, and there was coverage on the capture of a serial killer named Yu Young-chul, who used to kill a lot of prostitutes. She told my mum that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the eerily familiar yellow raincoat and hat that he was wearing when apprehended. This happened around 3 years ago. I was living with a roomie and going to school, and I was around 22. It was a weekday evening, and my roommate had informed me that she was going out clubbing and staying over at another friend's house. She had invited me, but I didn't really feel like going. Instead, I made plans to sit on my arse, watch junk TV, and work on homework. Around 10 at night, I went to the gas station to get some candy and energy drinks. I remember that day pretty well because I had gotten out of classes pretty early and had just gotten my hair done, and I was feeling pretty confident and cute. I went into the gas station and there were 3 guys just lurking around. They just looked like your average frat boys, probably in their 20s, and I remember that one had shaggy blonde hair and was covered in tattoos. I noticed one of them nudging the other and nodding in my direction as I picked out my snacks, but I didn't pay much mind. They paid before I did and left. After I got my stuff, I walked out to the parking lot and saw them sitting in a beat-up, trashy car, and all 3 of them seemed to be staring at me. I hopped in my car and headed back to my house, which was literally only a few minutes from the gas station, and they started their car and headed on their way. I didn't think much of it, figuring they were probably just heading the same direction as I was. However, I live pretty deep in a subdivision with a lot of turns, and after a minute of pulling in and making several turns, I noticed they seemed to be following me. I got nervous since I knew I was home alone, so I kept driving past my house. I pulled out of the neighborhood and back onto the main road, and they were still following. I just drove for a while, and they sped up and really started getting close. Then they started flashing their lights, and actually pulled up next to me and rolled their window down. The part of me that has faith in humanity thought, what the heck? Do I have a low tire or something? But when I looked over and saw them leering at me, I knew it wasn't anything like that, and I immediately began to panic. We were on a more deserted stretch of road now, and they were swerving almost like they were going to bang into my car, but I just sped up. All I could think was, should I drive to the police station? It's like 15 minutes away from here, and there's a ton of stoplights on the way. What if I have to stop and they block my car or something? Fortunately, by this point, I was getting somewhat close to my sister's house. She lives pretty close to me, about 15 minutes away, but in the opposite direction of the police station. My hands were shaking and I was trying to navigate the road with these douche nozzles speeding up and slowing down and trying to nudge me off the road, but I picked up my phone and dialed my sister. She answered on the 4th ring. Without preamble, I immediately asked her if Josh, her husband, was home. She sounded confused but said yeah. Josh is in the military and I knew he owned guns. He's a good guy, but we didn't really talk much and I wasn't particularly close to him or anything. Tell him to get his gun and come out to the driveway, please. By this point, I was near tears. I dropped the phone, startled, as one of those idiots threw something, a plastic Coke bottle maybe, at my driver's side window when they sped up near me. I finally saw my sister's house and pulled into her driveway. The entire house was dark. No porch light, nothing. I was so screwed I misheard her. They weren't even home and there weren't any neighbors that would be close enough to run to. The guys pulled up behind me so I couldn't back out of the driveway, and they all jumped out. They all started walking up to my car, and one of them even reached for the handle and yanked on it. By this point, I was fumbling for my phone again. Freaking hell, do I have a weapon in here? Should I grab my phone and try to run? Should I back over these bastards or just stay locked in the car? In the split second that I looked up, 2 things happened. First, I made eye contact with the shaggy-haired blonde guy, who was the one yanking on my door. He didn't look angry or drunk or anything. His eyes were dead and predatory. While I was frozen in terror, he looked cold, like he had done this kind of thing before or something. The other guys were trying my other doors, but I couldn't break eye contact with the blonde, who was inches from my face and only separated by a glass window. Second, I finally saw a shape move behind him in the darkness, and I heard a loud bang. All the guys stopped and looked, and my hero, my brother-in-law, stepped out of the shadows, creeping up from behind the house. He pointed his gun at them and told them to get the bleep out of there. They ran back to their car and sped off, screaming profanities at Josh and me. When they left, my sister ran outside and brought me in. The driveway scene sounds like it took a long time, but in reality it was only a few minutes. Apparently they had turned off the lights while my sister hid, and her husband posted up outside the house in a secluded spot where he could get a good view. The panic in my voice alerted my sister that we all could be in a lot of danger. Because of that, and because of how dark it was, we didn't get the guy's plate number. We called the police and they came out to get our statements. They said they would have someone patrol the area to keep an eye out for any cars that were the same make, model and colour, but that it would be hard to catch the guys without the license plate number. Unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. They never caught those degenerates. I can only wonder what they wanted with me, what they were planning for me, or what would have happened if Josh hadn't been there, ready to handle it.